Nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Nomine Patris, et Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Christ is risen. Welcome to the Meaning of Catholic. This is part 7, Christ Against the Occult, with Michael Joseph. Michael, how you doing, brother?
Excellent, Tim. Thanks for having me back. This will be an epic one.
Yes, so this will be possibly 2 hours long. We'll see. We're hoping to take questions as well, so save your questions. We haven't really taken a lot of questions during this whole series, so we'd like to take some questions. This is also going to be kind of the end of the main series, and Michael's going to come back on in a couple of weeks or months and kind of do a reflection on the more modern era. But this sort of sets up our modern epoch post-World War II. And these are also the things that we can be more clear about, because the post-World War II era is less clear because we're in it right now. So once again, the references are below. And then you wanted to say something about the references you're going to be adding.
Yeah, I haven't updated them yet for this particular episode, so within the next week I'll get to them because there's quite a few of them. And this time we're going away from Barwell's conspiracy theory reference to a lot of academic sources, but it's going to, oddly enough, corroborate pretty much everything that you went through in the last episode.
Excellent. So we marked this Marian Age. So this is the Marian Age, 1773. That's the suppression of the Jesuits, to 1945, end of World War II. I guess you said to me before we went on the air, 1950 is really the correct. I should correct that on the show title, because 1950 is the Assumption dogma.
Yeah, it says 1830 to 1950 is considered the Marian Age. So, we kind of play with different time periods overlapping here and there, but I think it's very fitting for the theme of this segment.
Excellent. All right. Well, where do we begin?
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about St. Louis de Montfort's views on Mary, because I think we actually see them manifesting here throughout all this history. So apparently Mariology was really flourishing in the 17th century, and this is what a lot of the Jansenists were revolting against, I guess. So there's kind of like a dialectic here where Masonry is going to exalt the feminine, but it's the goddess of reason cult, versus the more Pharisaic Jansenist kind of Protestants that become more anti-Marian as time goes on. So I'm just going to read through a couple of the things that he talks about in his Marian writings. He says that God wishes, therefore, to reveal Mary, his masterpiece, and make her more and more known in these latter times. So this is the times he is writing. He was saying this is all going to be developing. One of the reasons is because she kept herself hidden in this world, and in her great humility, she considered herself lower than dust, having obtained from God, his apostles and evangelists, the favor of being made known. So God wants to make Mary known, not necessarily Mary. She stays hidden, right? And so you could see this contrasted with Satan, right? He's the greatest created being. He falls from grace through pride, right? Our Lady becomes the greatest created being, full of grace with hidden humility. And perhaps they both have subtlety, but for the entirely opposite reasons. Satan's subtlety is to deceive. So this is all, going back to the Genesis 3:15 enmity. Point 2, Mary not only is God's masterpiece of glory in heaven, but also his masterpiece of grace on earth, wishes her to be glorified and praised because of her by those living upon earth. So here's like the Catholic version of as above, so below, heaven and earth, versus the Hermetic one, which is probably a very different interpretation. And then lastly, Mary must become as terrible an army in battle in the array to the devil and his followers, especially in these latter times. For Satan, knowing that he has little time, even less now than ever, to destroy souls, he intensifies his efforts and his onslaughts every day. He will not hesitate to stir up savage persecutions and set treacherous snares for Mary's faithful servants and children, whom he finds more difficult to overcome than others. So in other words, Satan, the more Mary is revealed, the more triggered he's going to get, and start doubling down on persecuting those devotees to her. And I think that really sums up this whole period we're going to be looking at in a nutshell. And so also consider, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of like the demonic territorial behavior. There's a quote from Father Ripperger saying that the one thing we always have to remember is that demons love places. For them, the attachment to the place is based upon the sin or evil done in that place. So we've seen a lot of weird stuff in southern France. Oddly enough, that's where, La Salette and Lourdes apparitions come. And then we also have weird battles. Obviously we talked about Alexandria going all the way back to Satan's kind of paradise lost. With Hypatia, the so-called virgin, the Gnostic Sophia, all that stuff is the alternative version of that. Also seen weird stuff with Bavaria and the Catholic areas of Germany. Poland will be very relevant here. And we'll talk about this later with San Francisco too. So just keeping that stuff in mind, these places and territories, and I think some of the dates kind of have these weird synchronicities that we can look at and maybe gain some hidden insights into, which I think are very interesting. And so just to summarize the episode, what I'd like to convey is inspiration for Marian devotions, inspiration for ecumenism with the Orthodox, and showing the amazing providence of God and the timing of all this, and showing the hidden enmity between the woman or the woman's seed and the serpent's seed. I think that's kind of what we can holistically view this all as. So that brings us to the Jesuits. So their suppression, there's a great book that I'm mostly sourcing from, Jesuit Survival and Restoration, A Global History. It's a Brill book, 1773 to 1900. And basically we have a looting of the Jesuits that goes on with the suppression here. They have like everything taken from them. So it starts in Portugal, then later in France in 1764, then Spain, the area of the two Sicilies, Malta, Parma, Italian places, and then the papal suppression in 1773, and then another kind of suppression with Austria and Hungary under Joseph II. And this has Old and New World implications. So during this looting operation, as you might call it, again, for various reasons, there's libraries with hundreds of thousands of books. Apparently lots of them were pulped because they weren't really deemed very valuable. And church gold and silver and metals were melted down for money. Liturgical vessels and textiles are all sold off. Artwork, they had like thousands of prints, collections of volumes of them, high-end art portraits. They even had portraits of enemies like Calvin, Erasmus, it says. And then some of these portraits were like Renaissance redos to make them more modest, let's say. So all that is kind of being taken here. Some of it's transferring powers in different hands. Some of it's being destroyed.
And I just want to, just for the viewers, we need to understand that the Jesuits were they're basically like another nation within these nations. They have so many resources, so much infrastructure that they've built, universities, schools, like you said, all of this, the value of books at this time, books, prints, paintings, nowadays we can print those off. Those are nothing, but they were very, very far more valuable at that time. This is just a ton of wealth that's all being used for the gospel, but looting it. So it's important to understand how much really is lost.
And then what they do after they lose this is going to tell you something about their spirit and their relationship with material possessions. And so, interestingly enough, for their survival, we can actually thank Orthodox Russia and Protestant England, especially under George III, ironically, right? And during this process of working with them, they were very grateful. They weren't Pharisaical and be like, oh, Protestants, oh, Orthodox, can't work with them, right? Like a lot of people tend to do. They did not have that attitude at all. However, they were still finding ways to be obedient to the Pope the best they could, even though they were suppressed by him. But the hand was kind of forced by the monarchs. We're not going to get into the whole logistics of that, but that's just kind of their situation. So they were very resilient. They doubled down. They got more hardcore. A lot of this was tied to Sacred Heart devotions, Marian devotions, and I'd say legalism in the good sense. And it was basically just this big grassroots underground movement. And this becomes the Jesuit conspiracy that gets reinvented during the 19th century. And so compare this to what we talked about with the Templars. I just think it's interesting. People can think about it what they'd like. So we have the King of France and the Pope, known probably most for the suppressions. And it's interesting that Clement V was the first one, and then Clement XIV was the next one. And in Gematria, if you add up the numbers, 14, 1 + 4 = 5. So it's kind of funny. Same namesake of the Pope, and the numbers kind of correspond. Now, it's interesting that Philip the Fair was known as being very fanatical about adultery being wrong. And Louis XV, well, he had a mistress, Madame Pompadour, who was an agent of Voltaire. And it's interesting that his whole family supported the Jesuits, but he was the one that suppressed them. And the Dauphin, the king, the next in line for king, he died before Louis XV died, so he never got to become king. He was supportive of the Jesuits. So it's interesting that a lot of the Bourbons were supportive of them, but not the head honcho of the time. And also, you know, the Templar suspicions didn't really want to be believed by most people, and there's a long, dragged-out trial. With the Jesuits, a lot of people were just ready to suppress them immediately, no trial, and Barwell even mentions this in memoirs. And so despite this betrayal, again, they just doubled down. And the only place that seems to be a little lukewarm, in my opinion, is in Maryland under Carroll. But there's even some things to be understood about his situation as well. So I don't want to paint a bad picture on a bunch of people. We're just talking about, again, the conspiracy of the fallen angels and human agents, you know, free will interacting with that. Now, interestingly enough, the Templars kind of fade into oblivion. Actually, I was reading more in Barber's book. A lot of them got in kind of trouble afterwards. Some of them got arrested, fell into more worldly things. Interestingly enough, those were the accusations against them. So it's not like they did what these Jesuits did, be like, oh, there was this injustice, we're going to double down and get back and be restored. They just kind of let it happen. And then everything got transferred over to the Knights Hospitaller, which became the Knights of Malta, who will be very relevant to this restoration, especially under Tsar Paul I. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the Jesuit influence in the East with the Kiev Academy. I know one of your guests before has talked about this. Maybe this will be useful in conjunction with that. There's a great JSTOR article on this called Theology at the Kiev Academy During its Golden Age. So this golden age of this academy in the Ukraine area, first I would mention, I believe that at the Council of Florence, this is the see that was most favorable towards reunion. Is that correct?
Isidore of Kiev. I mean, I'm not sure if who was most favorable. I know that he became a Catholic. He came into communion. And yeah, shout out to Lyndon Preddy. He is the one who did that show. He's in the chat right now. He's our deputized mod. So go. That is Greek Schism Part 4 after Florence with Lyndon Preddy. So look it up.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know if Isidore of Kiev was the most, but he was supportive of it. And there's always been a sort of a dichotomy between the Muscovites, the Moscow up north, and the Kievans in the south. Far more Catholics in that area. Obviously, there's a Ukrainian Catholic Church, the largest Eastern Catholic Church. So if he wasn't the most, he certainly was a significant player.
Okay, I think that's very providential with this. So in the 17th century here, this all kind of started, it seems, with a Polish-Ukrainian named Ivan Mazzipa. And I'm going to get these pronunciations wrong. I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I'm not going to try to pretend like I know what I'm saying with most of these words. So you're going to have to deal with it. So Mr. Ivan, he's the main financial contributor to this academy during this era of the 1615 through 1680s era. So this is kind of the establishment of this academy under a more Polish Jesuit influence. He was educated here, and then he's later educated at a Jesuit college in Poland. So he starts financing this. So there's kind of like a collaboration, it would seem, on some level, but it's going to be a little more hidden, I think. And so he's suppressed by history in both the Soviet regime and the more zealous Russian Orthodox that don't like the idea of reunion, it would seem. And so out of this, support by him arises what's called this golden age from the 1680s through 1750. And then after 1750, it starts to decline and go stagnant. And this is under Russian imperial influence. It becomes more in control. But the Jesuits might have something to do with a reinvigoration of this later once they're accepted. So this becomes the principal center of Orthodox learning later from 1819 through 1917. Surprise, surprise, that's when it ends. So apparently the records are a little less known, but here's what's known. It was a very important center for Orthodox education. It had a scholastic character, in its plan and methodology, asking questions, answering them, that kind of thing, like Aquinas. Efforts were focused on preserving and defining things, asserting dogmas, stuff like that. And oddly enough, some of the dogmas that they came to, or these assertions, ended up being very Roman Catholic, especially regarding the Eucharist. And then this Jesuit influence was also connected to a Peter Moihula. I don't know much about him, but he's an important figure, I guess. So basically, they're bringing in not just Aquinas, but I guess Scotus, St. Albert, Robert Bellarmine even is incorporated. There's stuff about the Council of Trent. The Western Fathers are discussed. Not so much Catholic canon law or moral or theological pastoral stuff, but nevertheless, they still viewed the Filioque as heretical. They still viewed the West as schismatic, stuff like that. But they even would use Bellarmine's arguments, I guess, to defend against Protestantism, because I didn't realize how much Protestantism is actually influencing them as well. So they were trying to have this kind of synthesis of faith and reason in their theology, it would seem, according to this article at least. And so here's an instance of maybe God's irony. There was one student, a Cyril Lucaris, who was later a patriarch of Constantinople. He uses Calvin's theories to attack Roman Catholicism from, coming from this academy. And then later in the 17th century, the patriarch Jerusalem uses Catholic sources to refute this previous guy, Lucaris. So there's like a little battle going on here. They're refuting each other, and one's more Calvin, one's more Catholic, I guess. So it's kind of interesting. And then finally, the Polish Jesuit influence goes away seemingly, and then it starts getting given more government money during this golden age, and then it starts flourishing. But you might want to ask, is there like a hidden Jesuit influence that they don't even really know is there, because now they're not really so outwardly attached to them? So I thought that's kind of an interesting backdrop, as like kind of like a foundation point of this East-West collaboration. So moving on, I don't know if you want to bring up the let's skip the Habsburg looting map. I forget about that. Let's bring up the second, number 2, the Poland Partition Map. Sure. So the Poland partitions in the late 18th century are really important to all of this. Interestingly enough, I didn't know much about them until I had to look into it. The first phase is what you see here, where the first phase of the partitions in 1772, I have them boxed in the highlighted area. This goes to, Russia, Prussia, and Austria divides up these areas. And then the area in black is still Poland. Now, this starts to become more under Masonic control with the Philosophers. This relates to a lot of Barwell's memoir stuff. But nevertheless, this is how the Jesuits start getting back into Russia, because this is a year before the ultimate suppression. So a lot of them end up in Russia during this time because of the suppression after this partition. Anyways, continuing. Now, the Polish king here, Poniatowski, he's having an adulterous relationship with Catherine the Great. Now, he's a pawn of Voltaire along with Catherine. And there's even a letter from Voltaire to D'Alembert in 1767, where it says that Catherine was driving philosophy on gloriously, and the fanatics were at their last grip in Poland, thanks to this king who's succumbing to all the Enlightenment principles. So Masonry is infiltrating here, especially in these black areas, because they're not going to be under really control of anybody but this king of Poland, who's under the thumb of Voltaire. Now, it's interesting that Catherine the Great asked D'Alembert to be a tutor for her son. But D'Alembert rejected it, and he just thought her asking was a sign enough that philosophy had spread to Russia. And it's this kind of providential, because later he'll be tutored by this Jesuit Father Gabriel Gruber, who becomes very important to this. Now, if you go on to the second map here, this will show the hidden battle of the Jesuits versus the Philosophers and the Illuminati. So there's two universities here that are really important. One is this Poland Academy that gets partitioned in with the first partition. So it's sitting there for a while. This is where the Jesuits really have their development. Now, there's another university circled Vilna, if I'm pronouncing it right. This becomes like the Illuminati University. It's very interesting. It's a lot of stuff seems to have these different figures from Barwell's memoirs that are attached to this place. There's a high up Bavarian Illuminati Jacobin member named George Forster. He died in 1794. So here's another Illuminati Jacobin connection here. This guy was teaching at this university. And of course, Weishaupt was all about infiltrating the universities, all this kind of stuff. There's an interesting connection to the American revolutionaries, and especially the anti-federalist ones. So this might make sense as to why Jefferson was favorable to Weishaupt in his letters. There's a revolutionary named Thaddeus Kosciuszko, who's connected to these groups. So in this place, there's like Masons, Protestants galore, proud heretics, it says, and ex-Jesuits, but perhaps these are the apostate ones or lukewarm ones that are just going along to get along. There's a couple ex-Jesuits here, but generally speaking, this is like a Masonic Illuminati university in Volna, which is, you can see right in the middle of what's still Poland during this time. So basically, if you move on to the next slide, you have some divine providence at play again. Now, Catherine the Great and Frederick the Great kind of turn on the Philosophers a bit. Obviously getting more anti-monarchical. You can see maybe why. And Barwell says Catherine, quote, became disillusioned with enlightened despotism later. And then, of course, Diderot is kind of kicked out of Russia. And Diderot's excuse for being kicked out was, oh, Russia's not ready for sublime philosophy. So they're just not enlightened enough. They rejected my brilliance, apparently. So anyways, Poland declares its independence with a constitution. This king is involved in this, and he kind of pledges allegiance to the Masonic way, not probably knowing what he's doing, in St. John's Cathedral. And this constitution of Poland doesn't really last long. Catherine invades the guy she was having the adulterous relationship with, probably turns on him as well. And so now this Illuminati university is now part of Russian territory. And this will be, in my opinion, a lot of the infiltration, that is affected upon Tsar Alexander I, who's kind of at odds here in this situation with Paul I, who's going to be much more favorable to the Jesuits. And also there's a Knights of Malta group in Poland that once this, partition happens, or this invasion, this will bring in a Knights of Malta connection to Tsar Paul I as well. So this really outlines all this stuff and sets the tone for it. And then also you can see territories that Austria inherits. This ends up with Joseph II strangeness and all of his policies that create all these problems and chaos. And he's just really just a complete... Joseph II seems like a really deluded liberal, in my opinion, whereas Frederick, as we saw, was much more glorying in the destruction of Christendom, but does turn on these philosophers later. So that's kind of the basic outline of here. I don't know if you want to mention anything about that.
No, sure. That's this is all very interesting.
Okay, so now the Jesuits are now in Russia, and the reason why is because Russia is suppressing papal decrees. And then actually Russia is viewing the Jesuits as being anti-Roman, anti-Pope, just because of their suppression. They're upset about it, but they're not that upset, but that's kind of the perception. So now all of a sudden they're anti-Rome, so they're kind of accepted. It's kind of a funny little thing. So it's because of Russia rejecting papal decrees. This is how they kind of get by on legalism. They're obedient to their state authorities, and so the suppression isn't officially pronounced in Russia, if you can see what I'm saying. Now, once Pius VI takes over, he knows about this, so he kind of lets it happen. Pius VI and Pius VII seem to be working towards Jesuit restoration, but they're still afraid of the monarchs in Europe that are very hostile to them. What's interesting, though, is in the year 1776, this becomes a key year that solidifies the approval of the order in Russia. So this lets them to really understand, okay, we're safe here now. So there's another 1776 plan happening here. And basically this expands and gets really strengthened in 1783, which is another important year. And they're able to operate under the Ignatius constitutions, everything that they've always been traditionally tied to. So it's more of a continuation of the Jesuits, just more hidden, more in secret. And then this will bring us to a relationship with who becomes the superior general of this new Jesuit order in Russia, Gabriel Gruber, and then his relationship with Tsar Paul I, which we'll talk about. But Paul I is assassinated, unfortunately. So in this Jesuit influence, they start basically doing similar stuff with that Kiev Academy. They're innovating a lot of the philosophy and theology, but also science and technology, because Gruber was a physicist and really tied towards more scientific, technological innovation, stuff like that. So he's the Russians are very thrilled about this. And so they're instructing in Latin, but it fully shifted to Russian in 1802. So they weren't trying to impose all the Latin on them. They actually adopted to the Russian language. And then here's another interesting irony. The Catholic Archbishop of this area is kind of like a tool of the state. He's appointed to basically just do what the Russian monarch says. So this is why the papal decrees against the Jesuits aren't published, because the Russian monarchs are forcing this Catholic bishop to not publish them. If you can see what I'm saying. So to get the ironies here, the providential ironies, and creating good out of evil, perhaps. Now, this archbishop seems to have like some crypto Protestantism. He was a convert from Calvinism. He's got connections to Britain. He's not a fan of the Jesuits, so he's going to be a problem for them later on. But nevertheless, to summarize it all up, eventually when they get expelled, it's because they're restored and all of a sudden they're associated with Rome again, unfortunately. And the quote I would say is given in here is, quote, "With their loyalty to their own institution," meaning the Jesuits, and to the Catholic Church, the Jesuits brought upon themselves the hostility of both the secular authorities and of the Orthodox Church. Under Tsar Alexander I, Enlightenment nostrums and Russian mysticism reared their heads, along with the Russian Bible Society and Freemasonry, all hostile to the Jesuits. Movements developed that were opposed to contacts with the West and the influence of the Catholic Church. The worldwide restoration of the Society of Jesus in 1814 handed the Russian Jesuits' opponents a new reason for hostility. It took away the Russian government's ability to control the order. So even though that they did all this stuff for Russia, once they officially were back with Rome, certain factions got hostile, but a lot of it was tied to Masonry, Bible societies, Russian mysticism. That's really kind of Lutheran mysticism, and a lot of these Enlightenment ideas. So that's really what kicked them out. So this is where I think people on the Orthodox side should really try to separate out the Jesuits from the Masons in this instance, kind of like some of the Protestants tend to conflate as well. And so that really kind of outlines all this. I'm going to get into a couple of figures, but I don't know if you wanted to respond to anything before I do that.
Oh, yeah. I think so. Overall, the bigger picture here that we see also from the 1600s through the 1700s all the way into this period, there's a great a flawed effort, but there is an effort of Russia to do rapprochement with the West in some way, to adopt Western customs, Western learning, Western theological terms, or at least some learning to it, the Latin language itself, Western music. So this is really a restoration of true Greco-Roman orthodoxy, which had been lost since the days of Justinian in the year 600, later after he died, they had lost the Latin language. And so there is a great good out of this time, even though it's very flawed because the czars are just sort of trying to dominate the church. They've suppressed the patriarchate. The patriarchate of Moscow at this time is suppressed by the czar. They just basically kicked out the bishop to control the church via synods. But even though out of this time there is this great rapprochement with the West, which produces various figures, and eventually the central figure of the 19th century, which is Vladimir Soloviev, who is the Russian philosopher who advocates a reunion with Rome, between Russia and Rome. And that eventually helps lead to the founding of the Russian Catholic Church. So all of this is all connected, and this is a great good of this sort of restoration of Latin that is somewhat brief because there is this strong reaction, like you said. And this is the reaction to this is still coloring the ideas of Eastern Orthodox today. They will still sort of talk about this period as this Western captivity of the church. They will disdain Western things in the way that the Slavify movement of the 19th century did. And so it's still with us today in this back and forth with the Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah, nothing new under the sun. But what's interesting is they're facing the same problem as the West, where it's the Renaissance ideas and which way you're going to go with it. And the Jesuits, as we know, are the ones who perhaps synthesize these dialectics in the best way possible. And so are they being given kind of two choices here? Is it the Venice of St. Petersburg is called like a new Venice or something, I guess. Are they going to succumb to the Renaissance occultism and all the masonry that's coming in? Or are they going to be influenced by the Jesuits? And you see this battle here. It's very interesting during this brief time period. So with that being said, let's talk about some of these figures that are really important here. Gabriel Gruber, who becomes the superior general of the Jesuits in Russia. He was an Austrian Jesuit who ironically served under Joseph II. And so he ended up in Russia. Now, it's very interesting. A lot of the fruits of this Jesuit golden age, if you will, in Russia are during the time period of when Joseph II is completely destroying Austria and looting the church. It's all during the 1780s. And so, again, he was scientifically minded. He was a physicist, and these helped expanded the technology efforts in Russia under Catherine and Paul. And in the 1780s were called the Years of Splendor. They're due to Gruber. And the Poland Academy is now also influencing philosophy and theology and languages and letters, grammar, stuff like that. All of this is being carried into St. Petersburg. And so later he's elected superior general in 1802, but unfortunately he dies in an accident 3 years later. So I wanted to talk about what I call the rock of St. Petersburg. And it reminds me of, Christ talking about binding the strong man, where it's all about Satan casting out Satan. And so perhaps the Enlightenment intermingling with Russia is producing some problems, right? And so that's what these Orthodox nationalists rightly identify as problematic, right? They're saying this is the Masonry coming in, right? But are they conflating that with these people like these Jesuits? And that's the important point. So also, is some of the symbology here tied to the powers and principalities war in heaven that we see manifested? And that's kind of the point I'd like to make here. So St. Petersburg becomes the new rock or foundation of the Russian Empire because of Peter the Great, as far as I understand. And of course, in 1917, this ended, moved back to Moscow. It becomes Leningrad, right? But during this time, before then, Tsar Paul invites the Jesuits to St. Petersburg. Now he takes over in, I think, 1797. And so they, in the year 1800, this is very interesting. It's 1,000 years since the anniversary of Charlemagne, right? This is when the Jesuits are invited into the Rock of St. Petersburg, perhaps very providential. So this becomes the second most important center in the college there. That's later closed by Alexander I when he expels the Jesuits first in 1815 and then later from all of Russia in 1820. And so their pastoral service also begins at this Church of St. Catherine. Now, I don't know if you wanted to bring up the slide. It's number 5.
Okay.
I'm just going to talk about it. It's going to pertain to things on this slide. So this Church of St. Catherine is interesting. It was consecrated in 1783, which is the year the Jesuits are fully affirmed here in Russia. And it's transferred over from the Franciscans to the Jesuits. This will be interesting in the New World when we talk about San Francisco, where it gets transferred from the Jesuits to the Franciscans once the Jesuits are expelled in, Catholic Mexico and areas like that. Anyways, so Peter the Great is known for chartering this construction, but there were complications, and it was initially designed by a Baroque European architect, this guy Trezzini. But anyways, so it doesn't happen. There's some delays, but later on, the ground is broken in 1763, which is ironically around the times of the partitions and the Jesuit suppression in France, right? And it was by a French architect. So it's interesting, the synchronicity here, the French connection. And then later, this French architect dies, and it's finished by an Italian architect in 1783, right when the Jesuits are achieving their solidification here. This guy Trezzini also built Peter and Paul Cathedral, and obviously there's some debates about Peter and Paul and rebukes tying to the papacy, so I think that's kind of providential as well. Maybe a more proper understanding of that. And this is on Peter and Paul's fortress, so it's like this own little fortress in St. Petersburg that all this stuff is built on. And this is apparently this Peter and Paul Cathedral, which is a Russian Orthodox one, has the tallest bell tower in all of Orthodoxy, and it was donated by, surprise, surprise, the government of Flanders in Belgium. So you have the Flanders connection here. And apparently the Nazis damaged this when they attacked Russia in World War II. So I think that's all kind of interesting with the namesakes of these places, considering the problems here of East and West. And then this, you also find a strange correspondence with Tsar Paul's wives. So before I get into this, just want to mention that this goes back to the Alexandria stuff. St. Catherine is seen as the Virgin Martyr of Alexandria, along the lines of another Virgin Martyr, Dorothea of Alexandria. And apparently it's hypothesized that the myths of Hypatia are taken from them because they died 100 years before Hypatia, but it's inverted to exalt paganism instead of Christianity. Surprise, surprise. So there's some mythos that St. Catherine was refuting pagan philosophers in front of the emperor and converting people to Christianity. Again, this is just mythos, but the emperor gets upset and kills the Christian converts. And, it's kind of like a martyrdom here. Whereas the myth of Hypatia is that she was refuting all the Christian arguments and everyone was flocking for her Neoplatonic wisdom. And then the evil Catholics killed her. So you can see the inversion of the myth around these virgins of Alexandria. But which one is it, right? This is the enmity of the serpent, the Gnostic Sophia versus the Mary Sophia, right? So it's pretty interesting that the second wife of Tsar Paul, she's proposed alongside this other wife by Catherine the Great and Frederick the Great working together. Catherine the Great wants an heir, but it's because she doesn't really like Paul. She wants a different person to keep running because Paul's opposed to the Enlightenment principles. And so the heir Paul ends up with eventually is Maria Sophia Dorothea. Very interesting namesake. And she ends up having 10 kids with him, whereas the first choice, she died in childbirth, and it's alleged that it might have been an adulterous relationship. So that's kind of interesting. So a lot of this stuff culminates in 1776. This wife dies. He marries Mary Dorothea, and then they have 10 children. So there's 1776, 1783. Interesting parallels here with Paul in his personal life and also the Jesuits gaining power and prominence. So Paul is going to be the one who is going to be the most favorable of all of the Russian monarchs to Roman Catholicism in history. And I think that that's rather providential. So I thought that people might find that interesting. Anyways, let's move on.
Okay.
So the Knights of Malta are involved in this as well. So let's talk about Tsar Paul I. Modern academia is not kind to him. They basically view him as a paranoid conspiracy theorist, despite being assassinated by a conspiracy, right? So he just imagined all that. He's an autocratic tyrant. He's mentally ill. He's got insane foreign policies. Now, there are admittedly some odd accounts of him, but in my opinion, from what I've read, it just seems more like endearing zeal rather than malice or maniacal. But he grew up being inspired by tales of chivalry, Catholic orders, medieval knights, stuff like that. Similar to Ignatius of Loyola, actually. Now, remember, the Templars, once they were suppressed, the Hospitallers inherited their wealth, and so they become the Knights of Malta. And so what happens is he begins a knightly quest once he ascends the throne in 1796. Thanks to his mother's imperialism, the Knights of Malta are part of his territory now in Poland. And they're like heavily in decline. They're just disorganized. Again, Masonry's overtaking this area of Poland. So he moves them out of Masonic Illuminati Poland into St. Petersburg, and he really helps them out a lot. And so these Polish Knights of Malta thank him, and they name him a protector of the order. That's phase one. Then Napoleon raids Malta and wants to go on to Egypt. And apparently Tsar Paul is very upset about this. So through this whole thing, apparently he obtained these relics from the Knights of Malta to protect them. One is the right hand of St. John the Baptist. One is particles of the cross of Christ. And one is an icon of Our Lady of Falermos, who's the patroness of the Hospitallers. And he developed a devotion to her, apparently, during this time. And these relics stayed with the Romanovs until the 1917 revolution. And now they reside in Serbia. And interestingly enough, in Serbia, there's a new Hagia Sophia that's been built in Belgrade, I guess. So it's very interesting, perhaps providential. So long story short, some knights side with Napoleon. They go to Egypt. They choose the Egyptian ways. Others flee, and some come to Russia. And they're mad because they think that their Grand Master, Hompesh, he compromised with Napoleon. He fled, and he didn't die for the faith, right? And so they, this is really strange. They decide they want to make Paul I of Russia the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta, despite him being married, which wasn't part of the tradition. He wasn't previously a knight. He was Russian Orthodox, not Roman Catholic. And he was also the emperor of a nation, which had never happened before, let alone the third largest empire in the world. So the Pope kind of contests this, but some European monarchs, including the Bourbons, support this. And so this led to a very complicated situation and disputes over the Knights of Malta, which is part of his so-called crazy foreign policy. But I think it's very interesting because he will actually die for chivalrous means, with not abdicating under pressure and being a martyr. So perhaps God is transferring powers over to somebody who will die for the faith. I don't know. One could make that argument. So before I move on, I don't know if you want to reflect on anything there.
Well, didn't you say that Tsar Paul I also promoted reunion between East and West?
It's more Gruber, the Jesuit, that's tied to this, which I'll get into here.
Okay, go ahead.
Interesting story. It's very inspiring, but at the same time, very tragic.
Oh, Lyndon adds Vitaly Varyun over at the Russian Catholic. He's a Russian Catholic, has a channel. He says that St. Petersburg is the Catholic heartland of Russia.
Well, it would certainly correspond with a lot of this. So anyways, there's an excellent JSTOR article on his foreign policy, and I think it's very revealing. I'm going to summarize the points from it. Interpretations of his reign is widely varied, a lot of hostility. But what is known is he was in full control of his foreign policies, being a despotic autocrat, right? And this was all during a dramatic time. Napoleon is rising. People don't know what to think about him. And basically, there was in order to legitimize the reign of Alexander I, right? Alexander, his son, who was more favorable to the Masons and is part of the plot to overthrow his own father. In order to delegitimize Paul's reign once Alexander takes over, apparently there was an effort to make him be depicted as mentally unstable and to, quote, deliberately misrepresent his foreign policy. So is this the Masons coming in, trying to make him seem like some crazy conspiracy theorist because he's thinking there's Jacobin conspiracies against him? And so this is basically the history today that we understand him as. Now, the resources on his foreign policy are a little limited, but it said what you can tell is that most of it comes from Western sources, which will be hostile to him, most likely. Even there's Catholic history that's very hostile to him. There's one exception. There's a Russian history in the late 19th century, but that was suppressed by the Soviet Union for its strong patriotic tendency. The article tells you the name of the historian. Now, Paul wanted to protect the island of Malta from British control because British interests started coming into this. And so basically, long story short, he wanted to obtain alliance with Napoleon and to get Malta from Napoleon and make all these other deals. But apparently, he was trying to place Russia as the predominant power in Europe. He basically wanted Russia to be in control of Europe. And he really wanted the island of Malta as well in this. And then so Britain's intervention in this, he started boycotting Britain. He got very anti-British. Lots of logistics, lots of details. People can read the article for themselves. I'm not really well-versed on all of these matters in terms of politics, geopolitics and stuff. But nevertheless, the article summarizes that despite being deemed as a crazy person, his policies, when you actually examine them, they were at least consistent, and they were no more or less crazy than any other rulers during this time because it was a very volatile time. And nevertheless, once he was assassinated, quote, Alexander's regime made a fast and thorough reconstruction of the foreign policy of Paul I. Now, that brings us to the very interesting aspects of an East-West potential reunion with Father Gabriel Gruber before his assassination, which we'll get to here. But I don't know if you want to reflect on anything before.
No, sure. Please continue.
Okay. There's a lot of reading on this, a lot of conflicting opinions, but I'm going to summarize what seems to be the best we can draw from. So there's a conspiracy to get Paul I to abdicate. They want to force an abdication on him. That seems to be very popular with the Masons and emperors. And so basically, Paul built what's called St. Michael's Castle because he didn't like the Winter Palace. He was a little paranoid there. So he built this whole palace or castle for St. Michael because he likes the medieval chivalry, all these Catholic orders. And so it got completed, but unfortunately it didn't protect him from death. So this is where he was assassinated, or you might want to say martyred. Depends on how you look at it. Now, Gabriel Gruber was apparently working towards a reunion proposal to bring Russia back into the Catholic Church. There are some disputes about this, but there is apparently documentation for this. I think probably some of the disputes are people who don't want reunions to happen and pretending like this was never a thing. And so there's a kind of a disputed account on this, but I think it's interesting. This is taken from Donald Treadgold's History, page 136 on the Western Russia. And he says on this assassination day, Gruber worked out, after correspondence from Rome, a draft of a proclamation for the reunion of the Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, and appeared at the door of Paul's study on the fateful morning of March 11th, 1801, as usual, to see the emperor and present the draft for his signature. However, Count Palin, who is one of the conspirators, he blocked his way and detained the emperor until he was about to be late. So he's avoiding the Jesuit from giving the emperor this reunion documents. This is the story, at least. Some people dispute this. And this made the emperor cranky because he was being delayed for a meeting. And so Paul dismissed Gruber with his draft of the reunion. And by the next day, Paul was dead. After the time of troubles, no Russian ruler ever showed Roman Catholicism so much favor as Paul. His death was a blow to that of the Jesuits and the Catholics, and foreign and Russian converts felt this very severely. Now, this abdication plot gone into an assassination. Seems to have mixed interests. There seems to be some Masons involved, some angry Knights of Malta who don't like the idea that he's Grand Master, more liberal or moderate Russian aristocracy that are supporting Alexander I. And even Alexander I apparently knew of this plot, but he thought it was just to force an abdication on his father. His father wasn't going to be killed. It wasn't supposed to lead to violence, right? Like the typical liberal pacifism. Our policies never lead to violence. And so this ends up with Paul refusing to abdicate, apparently being maybe struck by a sword and then strangled to death. So he was at least willing to die and not be forced into an abdication, unlike the Catholic Knights of Malta leader that was fleeing from Napoleon. So I can let you decide who you think perhaps was the more honorable leader in this situation, and ironically, the more Catholic one. But I think it's a very interesting story. So I'm going to move on to Alexander I, but I don't know if you want to reflect on anything.
No, go ahead. Sure.
Okay, so I call this an Alexandrian resurrection attempt, at least. But maybe there's more of a compromise with the Holy Alliance, which we'll talk about. There's a good JSTOR article on this, the role of the Jesuits in the politics of Russian education. This talks about the expulsion of the Jesuits from Russia under Alexander I. Now, there's three main reasons for this that are well known. One is that the Jesuits were an influence on some Russian nobility who converted to Roman Catholicism. People were saying that the Jesuits were proselytizing, which they weren't legally allowed to do, overtly at least. Whether that was happening or not, that's the accusation. Number two, the Jesuits opposed the Bible Society that Alexander I was favorable towards. This involved a Lutheran mystic, Barbara Julian. She's kind of like maybe like a Rasputin type figure. She gained some influence over him. In particular, the very same year that he expels them from St. Petersburg in 1815. She also has British connections to these circles. And Prince Golitsyn is one of the Russian nobility that's tied to these Bible societies. And he comes up in Barwell's memoirs as being an agent of Diderot and d'Alembert. And so this is the Masonic conspiracy, right? And various Masonic type interests. So after all the Jesuits did for Russia, Paul I and their education system, philosophy, theology, fighting against Masonry, fighting against the Illuminati, and a lot of the conservative Russians were in support of the Jesuits for quite a while. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But there's a fourth reason that this article says is lesser known, and I think is more part of the general expulsion, not as much the expulsion from St. Petersburg. But this has to do with a battle over education. Because the Jesuits, remember, they had those universities, the Polotsk University we talked about being that main one. And so once Alexander I ascends, he tries to implement all these reforms that are very similar, in my opinion, to Joseph II. I'm not an expert on all these types of policies, but from what I gather, it seems to be the case. So this is the Masonic Bavarian Illuminati reform, right? So this is going to allow, more lower classes to come in, the nobility. Basically, it just allows an infiltration to kick the old nobility out. And everyone says, well, that's not going to happen. You know what I mean? Like it's the liberal delusion, right? Now, what happens is Joseph de Maistre, who apparently is an inspiration of the Action Française movement later on, he comes and he tries to work with the Jesuits to convince Tsar Alexander I to go in a different direction and to reject these Masonic reforms. And he wants to try to use Russia as a divine chastisement nation against the French Revolution. So he's working with the Jesuits to try to convince Alexander I of this. And a lot of Russian conservatives were backing them. But ironically, due to the autocratic nature of the Tsar, he just didn't listen to any of it. And he implemented all of these reforms. And the Polotsk Academy resisted this and was able to at least gain their own independence. There's a lot more complexities you can read about, but nevertheless, think about this expulsion was because they were resisting public education, maybe, right? And then, of course, 40 to 60 years later, the Tsars start being assassinated by these very same liberals who all get into power, which was being warned against back during this time. Same fate of the Jesuits after being expelled from France. 40 to 60 years later, the French Revolution happens. Probably very similar to the New World with the Jesuits' expulsion, where the Freemason Simon Bolivar becomes the Napoleon of South America 40, 50, 60 years after the Jesuits are expelled. So you see a very interesting pattern that develops. I was going to talk about the Holy Alliance a little bit. Before I do that, I don't know if you wanted to respond with anything. Tim? Oh, maybe he took a break. I guess I got to keep going here.
Oh, no, sorry. I was muted for a second.
Oh, okay.
Lyndon is asking about which Prince Galitzin.
It's hard to tell. I'm not sure. There's a bunch of those people involved in the nobility. I'd have to double check, but I'll put it in the references when I can find it.
Okay, sounds good.
Anyway, so last thing about the Holy Alliance. This is pretty interesting. This is kind of like an ecumenical movement that's spearheaded by Alexander I. There's some pros and cons with it, it would seem. Nevertheless, this Holy Alliance was just kind of like uniting everybody on Christian values, right? Orthodox, Protestant, Catholic. So this was really an influence of this mystic Barbara Julian, who is part of that Bible Society. And also it has some weird foundations with an alleged Catholic from Bavaria named Franz Xaver von Bader. But when I read his writings or his views, they seem way more theosophical to me. He's got some weird views on gender, stuff like that. Now, the Pope didn't sign off on this alliance because of papal supremacy issues, perhaps. And neither did Metternich of Austria, who's going to start influencing the Tsar later and maybe talking some sense into him. Because Metternich, despite being maybe a little attached to Rothschild money as his Achilles heel, he's going to be very instrumental in fighting against Freemasonry and being a bulwark of Austria during a volatile time that puts Austria in a better position during the so-called Age of Metternich. But nevertheless, the Rothschilds are interestingly called the bankers of the Holy Alliance because they were giving out loans to all these people. We'll talk a little bit more about the Rothschilds in a bit. But nevertheless, pros and cons, it seems, with this Holy Alliance. But it's spearheaded by Alexander, but there might be some weird theosophical kind of stuff attached to its roots. I think it's interesting, but that pretty much sums up the Jesuits in Russia. I was going to move on to the other parts in America, but before I do that, I don't know if you wanted to respond with anything.
Okay, so yeah, just the main providential provision we have here for the Jesuits: the Society of Jesus, the Army of Jesus, who is betrayed by the Holy Father himself. Nevertheless, God preserves the Jesuits by means of the Eastern Orthodox. So who's next? What's next?
Okay, good. I'm at the halfway mark. We're at the halfway mark.
Yes.
So continuing on the same book of the Jesuit Restoration, I wanted to talk about the other Jesuit movements that are important, but the Russian one is the most important to their survival. The next one is the Jesuits in the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, and they're actually going to work with Russia during this time and the popes. So Pope Pius VI, and more importantly, the Seventh, is going to be working with these Jesuits in the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, Naples area, with the Jesuits in Russia, and it's going to become more and more solidified to bring about the restoration. So we can be thankful for the restoration to happen because of this connection here. At least this is what the book says. So this is all done in secret, and ironically, they say this is kind of done under the understanding of oral tradition. So getting old school with it, right? No official documents because people might find them out and get upset, right? So there's a Spanish Jesuit that's really important to this. I have his name. We'll get to it later. He's actually made into a saint. But the one that's kind of the unsung hero here is a Luigi Mazi Capitani. He's an Italian in this underground Jesuit network. So this guy, Mazi, he took a private vow of loyalty to the Jesuits in 1765, because this is when they start to get suppressed. They're a little afraid of what's going to happen. They're under heavy fire. Second point, he makes a special devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and he, quote, took the blood vow, which bound one to defend the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary to the point of shedding one's blood. So this is almost 100 years before it became a dogma. that they're making a blood oath to defend the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. Very interesting. And this is part of their underground devotions that are going to really fuel their inspiration during this time. He was secretly ordained a priest in the providential year of 1776. There were letters found to another ex-Jesuit that revealed all of this, and that's part of the scholarship. And it says, quote, "This revealed an active network of ex-Jesuits who exchanged books and information and tried to keep the spirit of the society alive." Now, there's some weird prophecies that were floating around about a divine chastisement with Pope Clement dying. And this was actually used against the Jesuits sometimes, where it's like a Jesuit conspiracy. They secretly conspired to kill the Pope. And this is kind of like Jack Chick Protestant conspiracy theory stuff that's tied to the Jansenists. And you're going to see a lot of that crazy Protestant stuff that's like super anti-Jesuit in the most nonsensical ways. I'd argue that it got its formulation during these times with a lot of these Jansenists that they're battling against. So this is going to reveal another underground battle that most people don't know about. Everybody knows about, at least, people on this show, the Jesuits versus the Masons. Well, we're going to reveal the Jesuits versus the Jansenists here that we talked a little bit about previously, because that's really going to be the first phase of this. So there was the battle against the Jansenists was raging in Venice and the Milan areas, and the Jansenists had apparently taken over a Benedictine monastery. Now, it's interesting, the Jesuits during this time, if I'm reading on the surface of these ideas, there seems to be like this kind of primitive Christian Zionism built into it, with this millennialist attitude towards the Jews, and the Roman Church is being viewed as the, Babylon, the beast, the whore of Babylon, that kind of stuff. This is Jack Chick stuff. And this guy, the Jesuit Mazi, is most responsible for the organized attack on this. And so thus this first phase is a focus on sound theological doctrine to combat the Jansenists. And this was all during the 1780s and 1790s. And this is going to correspond with some interesting stuff I found related to the Habsburgs, the emperors, in a little bit. So once they win this theological battle against the Jansenists, then they start focusing on cultivating virtue in these societies. And they team up with the Collegio Apostolico, which is a college that was found on the vision of Maria Antonia Grumelli. This order was actually founded apparently to fill the void of the Jesuits being expelled. So it's interesting that they find each other. And this order was designed for, quote, "the glory of God, the salvation of souls and of the entire church, and the conversion of unbelievers, the Turks, and the heretics." And this was all, again, coupled with Marian devotions to the Sacred Heart, the Immaculate Conception being held to as a dogma. And this is what the Jansenists were against, all this Mariology. So they start working with the Pope, Mazi, but he gets arrested by the revolutionaries. First, it seems, by the French Revolutionary generic powers, and then once Napoleon comes, he's even cracking down on him. And there's an internal battle here with this underground Jesuits. There's like a schism of sorts called the Pacanaris by this guy, Pacanari. He seems like a Simon Magus type, in my opinion. He seems to have kind of some of these Jansenist Zionist views, it would seem. Anyways, he combats him, and they kind of purge them from the circles. And you'll even hear about this guy over in America, the Pacanari folks. And interestingly enough, John Carroll rejected him. So he had at least some, foresight to reject that guy, because he's seen as like an apostate here. And so anyways, this Mazi, he faded into the history books, but the Spanish Jesuit Joseph Pignatelli, he's part of this restoration underground here too, and he's the one who's made into a saint. So maybe we can push for canonization in the future for this guy. So I was going to talk a little bit about the Habsburg involvement here, but I don't know if you wanted to mention anything about that, because I know you've talked about the Jansenists before.
Oh, I was just trying to find. I just found a good map. I was just trying to give everybody, especially for Americans, like we were just laughing before the show about lack of geographical knowledge. So here's Italy. Italy did not exist till 1870. Didn't exist. Okay. All you had was these kingdoms. So you have Kingdom of Two Sicilies. That's where the Jesuits are working. And then you have the Papal States. This is the whole area where the Pope is literally the monarch of this kingdom. And then the Duchy of Tuscany. Here's Milan and Venice. And up here is where the Jansenists are working. This is in Tuscany. That is where the Synod of Pistoia happened. So some have heard of the Synod of Pistoia. It was a Jansenist council condemned by Pius VI. And that happens in Tuscany. So you have this war. There's sort of the battle line of the Papal States between these two sort of warring, the Jesuits, underground Jesuits dominant in the Kingdom of Two Sicilies up towards the northern Italian kingdoms above. So just for a geographical reference there.
Yeah, that'll be relevant because what's going to happen with Austria later, they're going to be fighting the revolutionaries in northern Italy, but it seems maybe some parts of southern Italy might have been secured by these Jesuits in their underground. And these underground Jesuits are going to be working with the Habsburg emperors, as we're going to find in this next section. So I think this is really interesting because this corresponds with research that I've done in the past, and it was very useful. So I'm just going to summarize some of it. Now, apparently, Emperor Leopold II, who takes over after Joseph II, this is where they start to reverse the Joseph's policies. Some of them still, I guess, are attached to some of the liberal policies, but it starts getting purged more over time, it would seem. Now, it's interesting. I found some references to Leopold II believing in a Jansenist plot to destroy the church, and that Leopold and Francis, who comes after him, Francis is the one who becomes the Holy Roman Empire emperor title ends, and he becomes Francis, the Emperor of Austria, to kind of continue it on, perhaps more in tradition, not as legalistically, right? I'm sure you talked about this many times in your show, but nevertheless, these two emperors, basically, I would say that the ex-Jesuits are kind of like now aligning with them and probably really running the show behind the scenes. And this is what everyone's complaining about, right? The Masons and their conspiracy against the Jesuits. So it's also interesting. You can see this reflected in academic history in Germany. There's an influential German historian, F.C. Schlosser. I was reading through some of his works, and he complains about these ex-Jesuits working with these Habsburg emperors to hunt down Jacobins, and I guess, some of the Jansenists. He doesn't mention them, but they're part of this. And he's upset because he thinks these ex-Jesuits are slandering the Illuminati. And the Illuminati are these amazing enlightened folks who are fighting for reason and tolerance and all that stuff. And that these ex-Jesuits are a problem. One of them is Hoffman, who appears in Barwell's memoirs. He seems like an insider that Barwell uses as a source. And he obviously is favorable to him because he's trying to expose the Illuminati, right? He's an infiltrator of the Illuminati. And this is why, again, we see this reflected with Weishaupt and all of that crew. They're so paranoid about the Jesuits during this time. And this all makes sense. And again, this is an academic historian who's very well revered in German history that's giving you this information. That Barwell is giving you the same thing. The only difference is he's calling good what Barwell's calling evil and vice versa. So now we have this underground battle with the Habsburg regime where the ex-Jesuits are now taking over and hunting down Jacobins and Illuminati under Francis and Leopold. And this will make it to the courts of Bavaria, which we'll talk about later, another important battleground with all of this. But I thought that was an interesting reflection from some of the stuff that I've researched in the past. But nevertheless, I'm going to move on to the Jesuits in America and Canada.
Oh, let me just note here real quick, because this is the rise of the Carbonari and the Alta Vendita at this time. And the Alta Vendita is really not, in context, it's not as much trying to infiltrate the church sort of in the 20th century. It's about trying to unite Italy in a Masonic republic and take over the Papal States. And that's the political movement from about 1800 to 1848. So this coming out of the north, I've got the, let's see, let me just bring this up really quickly. So this is the Italian Unification as they advance from the north, like what you were just saying, Michael. So they come from the north where all these Jansenists are, and they're taking over all of Italy. And the Carbonari are part of this movement to try to take over the papal states. And this is the context for the Ninth Crusade. So that underground movement of Jesuits is so key to that because they're fighting against it from the very beginning.
Yeah, and now I'm going to shift over to America because this is an old and new world battle. The continuity is amazing, and that brings us to, the war in heaven schema and powers and principalities. But we'll get back to 1848 and the revolutions that culminate with all of this. So over to Canada, you've discussed this before with people, especially Charles Colomb, so I'm not going to get too much into it. But there's an interesting connection to the Jesuits with those battles in Quebec. So this is in chapters 21 and 22 of this restoration book. The Jesuits in Canada were mostly all from France. So this is back to that 17th century Jesuit group that we talked about, going back to de Montfort. And we'll talk about this later in its relevance to Portugal. So they are New France in a sense in America and Canada. And it says that they, quote, stamped a fleur-de-lis everywhere they went. And they also kept amazing records. So engagements with the Native Americans, we can have a lot of insights into them because of these Jesuits. The fall of New France in 1760 puts them under British control. And then this, ironically, is what spares them the suppression 4 years later. So it's also providential that King George III becomes king during this time. And as far as I understand, the previous Georges from Germany were more figureheads, so the Whig oligarchy could probably manipulate things better. But King George III actually wanted to be a real ruler and maybe started upsetting more people, both in Britain and the American New Worlds. And this gets into the whole conspiracy, Nine Sisters Lodge and all these connections to Voltaire and stuff, I would say. So anyways, nevertheless, there's another positive byproduct of the Enlightenment is there's talk of Catholic emancipation. But how do you define all that, right? So again, kind of taking good out of evil and Satan trying to take good things and make them evil. So it's interesting that the Jesuits conundrum here is different than Russia, where they're not allowed to make new members, whereas Russia, they could. Russia, they weren't allowed to convert anybody. Here, they're basically going to die a slow death, but they're going to be given access to all the important things during this time. So basically, they don't just wither and die and give up. They're like, okay, we're going to make the most of the time we have left here because they think that their order is going to die in France. So the younger Jesuits are going to be the ones who are, going to have the most impact here. So anyways, there's a General Murray of the British Army that wants to loot the Jesuits, and he's suspicious of them, but the Jesuits won him over, and he becomes very favorable to them. Perhaps like many of the Russians, who were suspicious at first. Now, the Jesuits have no political power. So in other words, their vote doesn't count. It's too bad because the voting is everything, right? So what they do have is private property, and they can educate, and the sacramental life is available to them. And it's flourishing, apparently, due to the Crown's benevolence. And even before the Quebec Act, this statement is taken here from this is a letter from the French local superior, the Jesuit Glapion, and this is to an English Jesuit in Maryland. So the Jesuits in Maryland know this situation before the Quebec Act controversy, it would seem. And he says, quote, of the Jesuits in Quebec, "We live very peacefully here. General Murray treats us with much honesty and has helped us on several occasions. All the officers are courteous towards us. The practice of religion is as free as it ever has been. I feel there is much true piety in Quebec. Confessions are frequent. When we are called to anoint the sick, we go there in full safety, day or night. We preach regularly and on every Sunday and feast day, and we have catechism for the children and of the parish in our chapel." So that's the state of Catholics in, British-controlled New France, where, centuries before they were hanging, drawing, and quartering Jesuits. So again, the ironies here and the inversions, if you know the history.
Yeah, it's very interesting how that becomes this provocation when the Quebec Act comes down and they just let the Catholics more or less continue with an establishment of a little Christendom here. And so you have the Jesuits that are not suppressed, and they're able to continue to convert and preach the gospel, which is a provocation to the American revolutionaries.
Exactly. And this will lead to Bishop Briand, who you've talked about before, where this is like the Jesuits are foundational to this guy having power and like basically he's going to be the one carrying it on. And so this is, interestingly enough, similar to Russia, where the British suppression of papal documents actually allows for this to continue. And there's some legalism involved and some omissions and perhaps oral tradition going on, where the Pius VI was aware of this, but he turned a blind eye and never really he just kind of ignored it and let them do what they're going to do. And so all of this kind of happens through Briand and then some of these Jesuits to allow this to continue. And so the Quebec Act only improves the conditions for them. And of course, there's some 1776 controversy surrounding all of that. And so since the Jesuits are going to die out, what they do is they arrange to have all their property transferred over to the Ursuline nuns and the hospitals and seminary schools for the bishop's control, to make better priests, basically, because you can't recruit any more Jesuits. Now, the last Jesuit died in, surprise, surprise, 1800, right? The 1,000-year mark of Charlemagne. And he donated, this is interesting, he donates the Jesuit estates to the British Crown to thank them for allowing them all of their hospitality. And apparently there's a lot of controversies over this property over the next 100 years, or I guess 60 years, I should say. Apparently there was McGill University is tied to this. A lot of controversies, but interesting that if the British have control, it somehow in the mid-19th century ends up back in the Jesuits' control when they come back into Canada. And so they were called back in 1837, but there was a long, complicated process. But in the 1860s, they got some victories, and now it ended up in the hands of the French movement of this time, which are tied to what are called the Ultramontane radicals and the Zealots, and people with the likes of Louis Veuillot. He's going to be seen as an anti-Semite, anti-liberal Catholic zealot. Now, apparently, this guy was, I think, an inspiration for Action Française as well, along with that guy we talked about, de Maistre, earlier in Russia. So this Veuillot guy is tied to all of these circles that the Jesuits are being restored to. And in 1888, Pope Leo XIII was able to finalize the restoration of this property. And then French Catholicism was becoming even stronger. And this is all thanks to the Jesuits working so amicably with King George earlier on. And so we can thank King George and his regime for this, just like we can thank Orthodox Russia for their restoration. And, so this is a new world, old world collaboration with the powers that Catholics are supposed to be hostile to. But ironically, when there's a little bit of compromise and people aren't technically violating any of their own rules, maybe there's a lot more progress to fight against the New World Order forces, and maybe that's relevant to our time. So that basically wraps up the Jesuits in the Americas. There's a little bit more with the American Jesuits. In my opinion, just to summarize it, it seems like they were a little bit more lukewarm. Carroll, I feel for the guy sometimes. Sometimes it's kind of facepalm. He wanted better Jesuits. They sent some from Russia, but they were too non-compromising in Russia, and he didn't really like them. So it's just an interesting thing. But he did make a Marian consecration in 1791. So if we think about, the problems with, quote unquote, Novus Ordo Americanism, well, if the sacraments and consecrations are still valid, we can be thankful for him for doing the consecration to Mary, I would say. And so I feel for Carroll in one sense. I don't know a whole lot about him from what I read, just a very conflicted figure. So I'm not going to be hostile to him. I'm just going to say, unfortunately, he seemed a little bit more lukewarm, and perhaps that's also relevant to Catholicism in America. So before I move on, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, this is great. What do you see as the Marian? So basically, we're seeing that the providence of God is preserving the Jesuits when they work with these heretics or schismatics, basically, while the church is suppressing them, which is very, like you said, is very relevant to our own era, where we're forced sort of underground in certain ways against bishops or popes who are suppressing things. We had a de facto suppression of the Latin Mass. Now it's been exonerated at this point, sort of a similar suppressing of a good thing. What do you see as the Marian element of this Jesuit underground period against the Masonic suppression.
In my opinion, this is just me talking. It seems like they have these fanatical devotions to the Sacred Heart of Christ and these dogmas of Mary that aren't even made dogmas yet. And interesting, isn't that the problem with the King of France not consecrating, leading to the revolution, right? So are they carrying on the spirit of what should have happened with Mary Alacoque? Was that her name?
Yeah, Margaret Mary Alacoque.
Yeah. So a Virgin Mary's request of consecration for the Sacred Heart of Christ, unheeded by the Bourbons. Well, maybe the Jesuits carried that on. Just we don't see about it. Maybe it's more of the spirit, and then they're dealing with these governments, and they're trying to obey the authorities, but also the Pope. There's a lot of legalism, but I would say legalism for good. And maybe that's relevant to this time for defending Vatican II or things like that. There's a lot of confusing things that we're going through, but maybe more it's just about our devotions and the spiritual life that needs to be at the center of it. And, you know, in my opinion, it would be tied to Our Lady of Fatima now and the Rosary. And maybe that is going to be a better compass of that in the sacramental life to figure out how to deal with all the crazy temporal and legal institutions that are involved during this time, and to work with people without denouncing them as evil or heretics or whatever, even if they freely choose to not see your way. Is there some middle ground that's quote unquote kosher, but you can still maintain to the dogmas you need to? I think that this is really what's going on, in my opinion, during this whole time. And I find it very inspirational personally.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very inspirational time, because this is really the Pope betrays the Jesuits. They're suppressed. Then Napoleon destroys all of Europe, and the Catholic infrastructure is further looted. And it's just a total disaster of the church in the 19th century, going up to the 1812, 13, 14, 1815. And it's a disaster. And then immediately there's a Catholic revival. And so it's an incredible time period, because it's Napoleon locks up Pius VI. He says he's Pius the last. He dies in France unburied. This is like the triumphal moment of the Masons, and then he conquests. So, but we need to have hope here, because it's quite a reversal of providence, and you see, like you said, that you're seeing this providential preservation of the Jesuits in unlikely places. So, anyways, we got to move on.
Yeah. So anyways, the Bourbon Restoration, I want to touch upon that real quick, because this ends when the Marian Age begins, 1830. So there's an interesting article in this book, how this idea of the Jesuit conspiracy and being tied to super monarchical ultramontanism and stuff like that is tied to this Bourbon Restoration as a polemic. And this is the irony. The Jesuits are seen as before trying to limit the rights of kings because they were suppressed by them. But now the Masonic propaganda is they're synonymous with kings because the Bourbons are trying to resurrect themselves during this period. So this gets into this underground Jesuit conspiracy, and this fuels all the stuff going on with the anti-Jesuit conspiracy stuff, especially in the 19th century WASP America. I would say a lot of this propaganda is formulated during this time of the Bourbon Restoration. And Charles X is, the last Bourbon. And so perhaps that's strangely fitting that, the Bourbons who didn't consecrate in 1830, this begins the Marian Age, but they're still dedicated here, but it's just not going to happen. Right. And so the other interesting thing, last thing I'll mention here, is that they're also starting to take Ignatius of Loyola and pull the St. Francis of Assisi on him, where they're trying to make his original vision seem different than this Dark Ages version that's developed. And that the Loyola Jesuits just went wrong, just like the St. Francis of Assisi turned into the Dark Ages church, right? So it's the same thing, same tactic, right? And so it's interesting that you're going to find this echoed in Blavatsky, where she actually says some favorable things about Loyola, but says that the offspring of Loyola are the worst. So even it just shows you the scholarship of the time. I even see it in the occult world in Blavatsky's history. Very interesting when I looked at that. And the last thing, Charles X was seen as the Jesuit king. That was part of the attack. But it's interesting, if you read Heinrich Graetz, he talks about there was a mythos around Rothschild where he's seen as the king of the Jews. And the interesting thing is the Rothschilds were they're bankers of the Bourbons Restoration. And so, I don't know, it's just like a weird, interesting Jewish parallel with Catholicism here. I just found that to be interesting. So,
well, that's very interesting because it's kind of the beginning of the counterattack against the Jesuits, because they attacked the Jesuits. They knew they couldn't really beat them in open combat with logical arguments, so they suppressed them with violence. And then when they were restored, now they're going to try to infiltrate the Jesuits, because it's all about just taking down the Jesuits, basically. So yeah, it's very fascinating that you said Blavatsky. So she dies in 1891. She's the one sort of trying to reinterpret the Jesuits. Interesting.
She's a part of the occult world doing it. Yeah. But anyway, so moving on, let's go to what I call the alchemical enmity and battle over Franciscan gold. This is very interesting. So I'm going to go to San Francisco here, and we're going to see kind of like a reflection of all these themes. So San Francisco was founded, surprisingly, in the year 1776, 5 days before the Declaration of Independence. And it was founded with a Catholic mass. And St. Junipero Serra, who much ado was made about during the so-called Summer of Love, he was tied to these missions. Now, the Jesuits, when they were expelled from Mexico, this is where the Franciscans filled the void. Whereas in Russia, remember, the Franciscans were tied to St. Catherine's that was given over to the Jesuits. So it's kind of a funny little trade-off here.
Do you want this slide right now?
Yeah, throw it up. Sure.
Okay,
sure. So consider this what we talked about, the Black Legend polemics against Spain, right? The Catholic Spain just genocided a peaceful Native American population, and their bloodthirst and their gold lust did all of this. And they just wanted to spread superstitious religion and a backwards, racist, ignorant empire, right? You even find the same history in Carl Sagan's Cosmos, going back to our first Alexandrian episode, right? So with that in mind, let's talk about the reality of the San Franciscan gold rush in 1848. And I researched this, and I was just kind of blown away. So the WASP Masonic establishment brings a multicultural and international gold rush to San Francisco area. And this genocides the local native population, which probably a lot of them were Catholic, or at least were influenced by this Catholic Franciscan culture, which was very much living like the indigenous peoples. This is the modernization beginning of San Francisco.
And just a quick note, the United States had conquested Mexico. This used to be Mexico immediately before this. 1846 was the Mexican-American War. So all of this area was Mexico, and then United States conquested it.
So is this Satan's gold rush, his alchemical gold transmutation, and we're just getting the namesakes of it as the inspiration of the people perpetrating it? So anyways, what's really interesting is this year, the first Masonic lodge is established in California, in San Francisco. Oddly enough, charter number 13, important Marian number. And this charter was from Washington, D.C., the Masons in D.C. So this is, perhaps trying to bring them back into the 1776 founding plan of the Masons rather than the Catholics. Now, this is really strange. Apparently, there was like cross-dressing cults that started out of this because a lot of men were going there and they were succumbing to kind of homosexuality and stuff. So here's the original YMCA village people culture of the modern world developing. And out of this, apparently there was a Chinese racism that developed where, this sort of like androgyny of the Chinese people was developed as an attack on them because they were coming over as part of this gold rush. So doesn't that sound like everything they projected onto Catholic Spain? Genocide of natives, lusting after gold, superstition, because the gold rush was just kind of a lot of mythos. And they also were racist towards the Chinese. Isn't that weird to you? I don't know. It's weird to me. But again, does that show the fallen angelic demonic projection coming through these particular institutions? And this brings about the rise of Masonry in California during this time. And also it's interesting, I just thought about this, when you read about these accounts of the Jesuits and just, the European colonialists, a lot of these Native Americans had kind of LGBT problems. And so it's interesting if these are like, the village people originally. It's interesting that this whole culture came out of San Francisco, right? The village people, YMCA. YMCA was originally a young men's Christian organization. And, you know, San Francisco's Summer of Love. We just had a recent Summer of Love with the tearing down of Junipero Serra and trying to attack St. Louis the Ninth, right? So you could see this weird battle with all these alchemical motifs going back to this golden age of Christendom, right? And or the golden age of Catholicism. So it's very interesting how there's these attacks on these things with these namesakes that go all the way back to these battles during the so-called Middle Ages, right? So I just thought that was interesting. And I would also mention, you know, we've talked about before how sometimes the Jews view Catholic conversion as a type of genocide. Well, does Masonry kind of view it the same of the Native Americans? When Catholics convert Native Americans, they might even call it genocide or want to call it genocide, right? Because Masonry harkens back to paganism, right? So I think that that's kind of interesting. Maybe there's like a dialectic there. I don't know. Something to think about.
Yeah, and this time period, the Masons have been working in Mexico to try to destroy Mexican Christendom. And the way that they did that was that they took Our Lady of Guadalupe, which the devils had no hope of rooting Our Lady of Guadalupe out of the hearts of the mestizo people. And so what they did was they exalted Our Lady of Guadalupe as a national symbol, a symbol of the nation, instead of a symbol of Christ. It's a symbol of Christ trampling the serpent. Mary trampling the serpent is what it is. But even today, you have the Guadalupe as a Mexican symbol, just a symbol of a petty kingdom instead of the kingdom of God. And so at this time, the Mexicans are suffering under this Masonic conspiracy in Mexico. And so this is, it's so astounding what you said just there, because there is the Franciscan Junipero Serra. And then you had that even very fascinating, because it seems that the demons were just not forgetting what was happening. The demons were continuing to go against.
And Louis de Montfort says they get more triggered as Mary gets more revealed. But is that in the spiritual worlds that they're seeing it, and we're only noticing it maybe more in retrospect here? But nevertheless, this transitions into the next phase of this, where maybe there's a true Francis spirit here, and what I would call a marriage of the Holy Spirit and Mary. That's part of Catholic, you know, Mariology, right? The idea of the Holy Spirit and the spouse of Mary. I think you actually see this in real time in history here. It's a very interesting story. So I'm going to go through it. Have you ever heard of the Spiritons order?
No.
Okay, this is interesting. People who are SSPX sympathizers might appreciate this. So the Spiritons order history, I'm going to give, this is in my opinion, God's Holy Spirit cult and Mary's union. And then we're going to have the satanic inversion we'll talk about afterwards. So the Spiritons were founded by a French aristocrat named Claude Poulard. He was born in 1679, died in 1709. He didn't live very long. He gives up a law career, because he's an aristocrat, to enter the Jesuits. Because what was happening is the Sorbonne, the theology schools, they were very aristocratic. And sometimes these Jesuits were seen as wanting to work more with the lower classes. So maybe these are like the real SJWs working for the lower classes, right? And so he's a friend of St. Louis de Montfort, interestingly enough. Now, he's another person who dies and is never canonized. Nobody seems to know who he was. I didn't know who he was either until I researched it. So this evolves into him wanting to found an order once he enters the Jesuits called the Congregation of the Holy Spirit under a special patronage of Mary, which was instituted on Pentecost in 1703. Now, this order becomes what's called the Spiritons, and it was founded to aid students in seminary school to make better priests, especially ones who couldn't afford and weren't part of the aristocracy. To serve the rural poor of France and do missionary work overseas. So it's a global mission. And over its time until the French Revolution, it trained up to 1,300 priests, interesting number. And the French Revolution suppressed the order and ended up with only one surviving member. Napoleon at least allowed it to reopen, and Napoleon at least allowed the sacramental life to continue despite the problems with Napoleon. And interestingly enough, the more Napoleon becomes more sympathetic to Catholicism, the more the Masonic history starts to turn on him. Albert Pike, you see this in his writings too. And so, interesting year, 1848. This will be the next year of note here, 1776 to 1848. This Congregation of the Holy Spirit, created by this Spiriton, well, it had a marriage, if you will, with what's called the Society of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, founded by a Francis Mary Paul Lieberman. Have you ever heard of Francis Lieberman?
Oh, sounds familiar. Oh, do you want the next slide right now? What says Spirit in Exile, lest Emperor?
No, not yet.
Oh,
that
okay.
will be after this.
Okay, sweet.
So here's where this connection is very interesting. Francis Lieberman, he grew up a French Jew. He entered the yeshiva school, but then he didn't like it and became an agnostic. So he's rejecting the Talmudic way, I guess, of Judaism. And then he gets influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So now he's perhaps turning to revolutionary, Jewish spirit, to quote E. Michael Jones. And then, though, he gets a copy of the Hebrew Gospels, which we could probably thank Catholic Spain during this time, because a lot of there's maybe an attack on Hebrew language during that time as a reaction that's unfair, because I think there was a lot of good ecumenism with the Jews that maybe goes unnoticed during the Renaissance time as well. But nevertheless, he enjoys Jesus's teachings, but he can't accept the supernatural stuff. But he has some friends who convert to Catholicism, and that tips the scales for him. So in 1826, he converts and is baptized on Christmas Eve. And he takes the name Francis Marie Paul Lieberman, right? Lieber, free man. So is he a free man in Christ, like Paul, converting to Catholicism, right? After persecuting the Christians. So it's very interesting, right? So his Jewish father, now rejects him as spiritually dead because he converted to Catholicism, because he was a big rabbi scholar. So he enters the priesthood, but he can't become a priest for 15 years because he has epilepsy. So he suffers for 15 years and then enters the priesthood. And then he founds the Congregation to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. This is to free slaves in the Republican territories of France, all the Caribbean slave trade. He also works in Africa, and many of these African recruits, they die while serving there. He merges this with the Order of the Holy Spirit, like we talked about, going back to St. Louis de Montfort circles in 1848, right? So Catholic theology and real life merging these orders. And interestingly enough, if we're going to take Kabbalistic mysticism and invert it for Catholicism, here would be an example I would posit. He dies at the age of 49, just before his 50th birthday. That's kind of like the Jubilee, right? Isn't there a debate? Is it 49th or 50th year or whatever? And so coming from a Jewish background, is this like being relieved of all of his debts? It's very, very symbolic, very interesting, right? And so you could make an argument that maybe there's a metaphysical statement being made there. So he basically merges and allows this order to continue on. He's called the second founder of the Spiritons order, and he's declared venerable by Pope Pius IX. And here's where it gets interesting. And this culminates with Archbishop, I don't know when he became Archbishop, but Marcel Lefebvre is elected as Superior General of the Spiritons Order in 1962. And he purges it. He wants to purge it from modernist influence. He's getting rid of books by Yves Congar, Chenu. He's trying to reform the Spiritons because it's all infiltrating. Apparently, a revolt happens against Marcel Lefebvre, and it makes him impossible to lead because nobody will obey his orders. So then he leaves and starts the SSPX. And then after this, the Spiritons lost a lot of their presence. Wonder why. But that's the story of the Spiritons going all the way back to St. Louis de Montfort and the Jesuits in these circles during this time where Mariology started developing. So I don't know if you want to respond with it, but I found it very interesting.
That's fascinating. I just looked up, this is the seal of the Spiritons. And this is depicting the Trinity. The triangle is the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, and it is depicting the Immaculate Conception. So this is going to be interesting because I noticed on your next slide there's the corruption of this seal.
Yes, you can actually put this slide up if you'd like now.
Okay. So if you take a look, take a look at this, viewers. If you look at this is the Christian symbol, and then here's the inversion.
So now we're going to bring it all the way back to the alternative Franciscan cults that we talked about, the Gnostic communist ones. And this perhaps is the hidden enmity and a different Holy Spirit, if you will, the more feminized, maybe Pachamama one. So if you look up this ties to the Portuguese Isles. And so there's two autonomous isles in Portugal. One is the Azores, one is Madeira. This is where Karl of Austria died, the latter. And again, this isn't to talk about the people of these islands in any bad way. This is just talking about the weird spiritual battle that's going on. And these are like the territories or vehicle for it. So I'm sure there's plenty of people in the Azores who are devout Catholics. This is more about the battle, not talking about the people here. But there's a lot of strange things attached to it with this alternative cult. So I did a lot of research on this. I'm going to summarize it. And it's taken from academic studies and also an interesting blog of an atheist traveler who explores these Azores Islands and gets this mythos that corresponds with academia. So interesting enough, this dogma of perhaps the Luciferian faith is also being preserved on this island in Portugal. Maybe a Fatima inversion here. So anyways, this cult that's surviving here is a mixture of spiritual Franciscan influence, or the Fraticelli, Joachimites. There's Knights Templar mythos mixed in with it. There's Judaizing Alumbrado kind of overtones, and also the Flemish Beggards or Beguines. Everything goes back to the Guadalupe battles we've talked about, and the monastery in the Old and New World, right? And the Mexican City Inquisition purge. There's also kind of like these weird, what I'd call spirit cooking rituals on these islands. And it's kind of like pantheistic animal sacrifice involving an ox or calf. There's also like this weird emperor crowning ritual where it's sort of evolved into a young boy being dressed up an elected emperor and dressed in glorious attire. And he's kind of being sort of mocked. Oh, he's king, right? An 11-year-old boy is now king of us, right? So it's kind of like an equality kind of thing in an emperor mocking ritual. And it really makes me think of the scene in Luke 23 where Herod and Pilate are meeting. It's only in Luke, right? Kind of one of the more Marian gospels. And it's crowning Christ with like glorious attire to mock him. And this kind of emperor mocking ritual. And also consider, I wouldn't recommend watching it, but if anybody's seen Ridley Scott's Exodus movie, the visible representation or manifestation of God is like this spoiled brat child in that movie. So is this like the satanic projection where he's the spoiled brat child and projecting everything he's doing onto Christ and the creator, and it's manifesting in Hollywood, maybe in some weird rituals of like mocking emperor crowning cults, stuff like that? I don't know. I'm just speculating here, but I do find it very interesting. And so that's kind of the mythos of this tradition that's being preserved on these islands. And actually somebody I've been in correspondence with an email says he lives in the Azores Islands and he finds it all very interesting. So he was telling me a little bit about his experiences, but nevertheless, this relates to the idea of the last emperor on Portuguese Isles. So before I get into that, I don't know if you wanted to respond with anything.
Sorry, I keep on muting myself. Yeah.
And I'll explain the slide here too.
Yeah, certainly. Go ahead. This is fascinating.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So this is the seal of the Azores Islands. And it's interesting that if you look to the left of it, this is like a Crowley Golden Dawn OTO type symbol. The OTO are apparently like supposedly Templars, Order of the Templar Orientis or whatever. So you see the Templar cross and you see the spirit or the dove, right? But is this an alternative Holy Spirit? And you see this in one of those Crowley magic sigils with the eye of, Horus or whatever, and the dove descending into this Templar cross. And this is part of their initiation process. A lot of weird Crowley stuff. Not going to get into all that, but nevertheless, I think it's interesting because you could see that on the Azores and you have this bull in chains. Again, I'm just saying we're talking about broad symbolism. People can interpret it different ways, but if you're going to interpret it in the alternative Franciscan way, that would be kind of interesting. So this leads into this emperor battle I call the last emperor. Now there's this line, the Braganza line. I think I said Branzaga last episode. I screwed up. This is tied to that Fifth Empire, weird Judaizing millennialist stuff that ties into Manasseh ben Israel and the Dutch connection and that Jesuit Vieira. We've talked about him already. But nevertheless, I was reading some interesting works talking about this line and how some of these people were viewing the union with the Castile crown under Spanish dominion from 1580 to 1640 as a type of Babylonian captivity. Very interesting. It's like the Avignon papacy, right? So this has all those weird connections we talked about. And this kind of culminates in one of these first endings of this line under John VI of Portugal. Now, he is seen by Madame Blavatsky in Isis Unveiled as like this super esoteric Templar, and she claims he's assassinated by the Jesuits, Jesuit conspiracy stuff. And she says that he's preserving the secret doctrine par excellence. This is her version of John VI of Portugal. Now, when I researched this guy, in reality, he seems more like kind of a doofus. He's got these Rothschild connections. Even the Rothschild website will talk about them. He was a major slave owner. Pope Pius VII wrote him a letter asking him to stop the slave trade, not appealing to any papal authority, but just Christian charity out of goodwill. And he basically ignored it. So he has a slave system in Brazil. And it's ironic that Blavatsky is being used by the United Nations, which hates evil slave owners so much, as the rock of their spirituality. And she's praising this guy as being the most esoteric Templar of all time. So is that kind of a hypocritical, interesting, providential thing? But nevertheless, he's ignoring the Pope to end slavery in Brazil. Now, his sons, Pedro I and Miguel I, fought over the crown after this. And this turns into a very interesting battle. Pedro I, I'd call him the last Masonic emperor. Here's an interesting story about him. While he's in Brazil, he's the emperor of Brazil, because there's a Brazil-Portugal connection here in the New World. Now, on May 13th, interesting date, 1822, almost 100 years before Fatima, he is called the perpetual defender of Brazil. Interesting they use the word perpetual. And he was initiated into Freemasonry later that year. And that's the year that King John VI basically loses his crown or hegemony here. There's a lot of weird stuff going on, a lot of complicated stuff, but nevertheless, this is very interesting. His Masonic initiation, he was initiated under the pseudonym of the last emperor of the Aztecs, Cuauhtémoc. I don't know. I'm sure I'm butchering that.
Quetzalcoatl?
No.
A different one?
Cauthemoc. Anyways, this is the last emperor of the Aztecs that Hernan Cortez conquered. And so he's being initiated as the spirit of this last Aztec emperor. That's his like patron saint, if you will, in this Masonic initiation. And so it's interesting that the mythos is that Hernan Cortez conquered this last Aztec emperor, and the emperor asked to be suicided by Cortez. He's like, kill me. And Cortez apparently refused to kill him. And he said that he defended his capital like a brave warrior, and that Spaniards show respect and valor even to an enemy. So much for the Spanish being evil, brutal killers of the Aztecs. He spared his life and even said he fought valiantly for his people. So this is what he's trying to resurrect, the spirit of this last Aztec emperor, which is, part of the sacrificing on pyramids culture, right? So this is what he's initiated into. Now, it's interesting. He shows up on the Azores Islands to try to overthrow his brother, who's an absolutist Catholic, Miguel. We'll talk about him in a second. And on this Azores Island, all the exiled liberals are there waiting for him. So this spirit in exile, the Gnostic Sophia in exile, is on this Azores Isle with their last Masonic emperor. And they team up with him, and they basically overthrow him, but it's not very long lasting because he dies. Now, the interesting thing is the person he overthrew, his own brother, Miguel I, he resurrects the Order of St. Michael of the Wing with papal approval in 1848, interesting year, to fight the Freemasons. So we have the merging of the Holy Spirit and Mary congregations in 1848. And then we have the resurrection of the Order of St. Michael to fight the Freemasons in 1848 from Miguel I, right? Another Michael. And so is this the 1848 revolutionaries you never hear about, right? And he seems to be in the circles of Metternich, Nicholas I, Charles X. And he dies in exile in Bavaria in a Franciscan monastery. Interesting, if you think back to Occam, he's the spiritual Franciscan who dies in exile in Bavaria. That's the other Franciscan cult, right? So just a lot of weird stuff with spirits in exile and people dying, and these like little attacks in these sensitive areas, in particular Bavaria. So I think that's all very interesting with Karl of Austria, who dies at the other island in Madeira. And he had Marian devotions. He's buried in a Marian church. He consecrated himself to the Sacred Heart of Jesus in 1918. And, his was the peace plan that was rejected, right? So very interesting stuff. So I can wrap up on some few more things with the last 10 minutes I got here. But before I do that, if you wanted to mention anything.
Cool. You want to just take 10 more minutes, I guess? Yeah. I just wanted to go ahead.
You said we can go till 5?
Oh yeah, we can go till 5.
Okay.
Let me throw out questions if anybody wants to throw out questions. And
then if we can go till 5, maybe if I can do like 20 more minutes and then the questions after that.
Yeah, go for it.
Great. Okay, awesome. So this brings us to the 1848 culmination period. So maybe if you could put on the slide number 8. I'm just going to summarize a lot of research. I don't have time to go into it all, but it's very interesting, I think, in conjunction with this. I think 1848 is a very culminating year. So we have the rise of the Rothschild before this time. He comes into Christendom because of the Hesse Castle Landgrave William IX. And that Hessian deal we talked about, that was very strange before, that was his entry point into these Landgraves. So the son of that deal is going to inherit this Landgrave. And so he starts working with Rothschild closely. And then during this time, Napoleon comes in. So he basically gives Rothschild all his money and says, hold on to it for me because Napoleon's going to try to loot it all. And so Rothschild, apparently he does some like smuggling, maybe. He does some investments in England. And he does give the money back to him. So he was honoring that agreement. And some people are going to probably, get upset about this, but sometimes I think some things with the Rothschild are a little exaggerated and a little unfair. Nevertheless, there's obviously some problems here. But anyways, the Rothschilds are more supportive of the Tories, the monarchies. They seem more comfortable operating under constitutional monarchies. Now it's interesting. Nathan and James, the 5 major sons of Rothschild, Daddy Rothschild, they become Masons in a lodge in London, and they start banking in London and Paris. And this ties to the Bourbon Restoration and then Louis Philippe later, who's part of Philip Egalité's line. And then they also spread to Naples, right, to Sicilies area, and also Vienna to the Habsburgs, and they start intermingling with the Habsburg aristocracy. And then one stays in Frankfurt. So this is when they start loaning out all over Christendom. They're loaning to Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox powers. This is all around the Holy Alliance time that we mentioned. Now, it's interesting that the papacy is the final institution to succumb to needing Rothschild loans. And that happens later. And it's basically to repair from all the Masonic revolutions that you mentioned with the Papal States. The Rothschilds try to use this to leverage certain Jewish rights, but the papacy doesn't budge on them. Now, there's another interesting connection here. If you look at the map, there's the Metternich's regime and the Bombell family. They're kind of a hidden family. I've never found such crazy propaganda when I look back to different articles and different newspapers at this time against this Bombell family. They're Portuguese. They're very interesting. Basically, the most prominent one marries Napoleon's wife when Napoleon dies, Marie-Louise, Charles René Bombell. He's part of the diplomatic team with Metternich. They're all trying to work with the island of Sardinia and the government to try to stop these revolutionaries in Geneva, Switzerland from pouring into Italy. They're trying to shut down Masonic theater productions. A lot of the theater stuff is being used to attack the arts, whatever. So they're all a part of this. And then later on in 1848, the revolutions come. Metternich's Achilles heel is probably Rothschild money. He flees in 1848, and this is where Franz Joseph rises. And Sophie of Bavaria is one of these people, again, Bavaria, who gets so much hate throughout history. I don't know a whole lot about her, but I would have a feeling that's probably a lot of exaggerated polemics. Think about it, Sophie, the spirit of Bavaria. Which spirit here? But anyway, so she's very adamant about Franz Joseph getting on the throne. She gets her husband to let him because he's seen as kind of weaker. And so anyways, you can also see there's another battle here with Munich and Bavaria that's tied to Switzerland. Now if anybody's going to argue against Catholic monarchy, the best person you can use is Ludwig of Bavaria to do so. This is absolute monarchy gone wrong. And this is the libido dominandi effect. I suggest people look into the story of Lola Montez. This is like the most frustrating story you'll ever read, where this woman is basically, he's in an adulterous relationship with her, or trying to be, and he's just giving her all this money, and she's basically just introducing him to all these Freemasons and screwing up the plans of the Catholics aristocracy in Bavaria. Now, it's interesting that anytime anyone attacks Lola Montez for being problematic, then they allege a Jesuit plot. So basically, Ludwig and Lola are in such deep love that the Jesuits are jealous and they're conspiring to separate their love. All these crazy things. Lola Montez is just everything she doesn't like, she blames on a Jesuit. It's kind of like liberals today calling everything a Nazi. And so basically, Ludwig probably gives more money to Lola than all of Bavaria. And she gets elaborate vacations in Switzerland, stuff like that. And so, surprise, surprise, Ludwig is forced to advocate in 1848. Perhaps there's some karma involved in that. But he is hostile to the Jesuits, and all these people are trying to tell him that there's a Masonic plot and all these problems, and you should listen to us. But he's rather listen to Lola, who's introducing him to all these Freemasons. So that's the libido dominandi effect in full effect, if you ask me. And the last thing I would mention here, if you want to move on to the next map.
Sure.
This is an interesting map. This is all the revolutions of 1848. I'm going to talk about Frederick William IV in a second, but if you notice on this map, notice who helps put down the revolution. It's all in gray arrows. You'd have to zoom in. You can find this on Wikipedia. I'll put it in the links. The 1848 revolutions are put down by the Austrian government, Orthodox Russia under Nicholas I, any rabble forces left of France, Spain, and Italy that probably still care about Catholicism. And notice how Italy has less cities attacked, but Rome needs 3 different forces to suppress it. So this probably relates back to what you're talking about with the Carbonari operations. And there's even a small remnant of the Ottoman Empire that helps suppress this too. Maybe that's providential with Muslim conversion. I don't know. But notice where the revolutions are not. They're not in Britain, just like the French Revolution. The Low Countries and Switzerland area, the more neutral territories, which developed to be more perhaps Masonic revolutionary harboring territories. And then it seems that only in Paris is the place that they have a revolution. So just for good measure, we can't have Catholic France resurrected. So out of all this chaos that's coordinated during a time where they didn't have much technology, a lot of these areas are not modernized. That only happens later, especially in Austria, as far as I understand. Franz Joseph arises out of this. This freaks the liberals out, especially when he's more obedient to the Pope. As far as I understand, he's not necessarily much of a believer in Catholicism, but he's still loyal to the tradition, the Pope. And this seems to be when the liberals hate him the most. I see the worst propaganda against him. Later on, I think he softens a little bit. But that guy, as far as I understand, I'm not an expert on the Habsburgs, but I feel for the dude. A lot of bad stuff happened to them during this time. And they're like the last bulwark in terms of governments defending against all this nonsense. So before I mention the next part and wrap up, Frederick William IV, he's the King of Prussia during this time, during the revolutions. He's very sympathetic to Catholicism. He's sympathetic to the Pope. And there's examples in particular history where he's depicted as being shackled to a Jesuit, a puppet of the Pope. The WASP Masonic media did not treat him kindly. And you can see a picture in that slide of him looking very apish with the Constitution folks beating down the door saying, please let us have liberty, right? So he's seen as more of a romanticist. And again, when Protestant rulers become sympathetic to Catholicism, boy, they certainly get a lot of hate from a lot of different viewpoints. And I find that also to be maybe very telling to things going on during our time. So before I bring it over to America with this anti-Catholicism, I don't know if you wanted to mention anything.
Someone was asking where all these revolutions were coming from. So these are all liberal revolutions, meaning so-called democratic, so-called republican revolutions, which are just trying to overthrow the government, overthrow the monarchies to create some kind of representative government.
Yeah, I think it's a mixture. Like this is when Marxism starts developing. You have like liberals that are tied more to laissez-faire capitalism, as far as I understand. There's the pan-German nationalist stuff coming out of it. It's just a big mixture of all these different forces, but they're all saying no to the Catholic order, it would seem. And I think that that's really what's probably most important. So all these dialectics battling, and actually that will be very relevant, something I can mention a little bit later. But nevertheless, this relates to 19th century. And I would say this book here, Transatlantic Anti-Catholicism by Timothy Verhoeven, this will purge you of your Americanism if you ever read this. It's so amazing, the amount of anti-Catholicism in the WASP Masonic Alliance in America during this time. It's just unbelievable. So I'd suggest people read that. It's not a very long book. It's well documented. And it just basically shows you what the New York Times version of America was back then. It's very different than the one you see now, but perhaps the anti-Catholicism is the synthesis point. So with that in mind, this is where you have Blavatsky and Albert Pike's occult writings being developed. They all lived during this century. Here's an interesting quote. This is Blavatsky from Isis Unveiled, where she's quoting Albert Pike, who she deems a very worthy adept, to explain the secret doctrine. And she says that Albert Pike is saying that the source of the Masonic doctrines basically go back to Hinduism. That's what he's saying. And he even mentions that, quote, our adversaries, numerous and formidable, will have the right to say this. So people accusing Masonic wisdom of being kind of like Hinduism or of the East, he's saying they have a right to say that because that's what it is. And Blavatsky chimes in here, and she says, of these adversaries, numerous and formidable, that Pike says, who are these adversaries, right? That's what she's asking. And she says, it's useless for us to inquire. They are the Roman Catholics. So the formidable adversaries of the Masonic secret doctrine are the Roman Catholics, according to these occultists in the 19th century that are very influential on the UN today. So Albert Pike, a quick bit about him. He's an interesting character. He's very pro-slavery, but he also plays the noble savage card, if you will. He's trying to defend Indians' rights. He ends up criticizing his superiors during these wars and calling them all buffoons. But of course, when he becomes a superior, he's seen as a horrible leader. And he even has Indians in his regime who are accused of scalping. So he can't really control them. And he's kind of accused of war crimes. And that's when he flees the war crimes accusations and goes and writes Morals and Dogma. Now, he is acquitted of them later, but nevertheless, it's kind of interesting that he fled them initially. He was part of the Know Nothing Party, very anti-Catholic. They were trying to take the North-South slavery battle and be like, we need to stop focusing on this, guys. It's not really that much of an important issue. The important issue is Catholic immigration and not allowing it. So that seemed to be what some of these more radical circles were promoting to try to keep Catholics out of America during this time. And you also have the world religions movements formulating in the late 19th century. There's a lot of Fabian socialists tied to this, theosophical vegetarian cults. You probably see people like Gandhi that's mixed up in this later. Margaret Sanger's the theosophist. All these different circles. This is kind of like the reaction of capitalism. They don't like the Rothschild or any of these capitalist folks. So that's kind of like that dialectic of capitalism and communism forming during this time in America, it would seem, in my opinion. But if I wanted to summarize this book, because I think people might find this very interesting. Think about the idea of God judging nations and, Christ saying you'll be measured by the same standard of judgment, right? And think about it. WASP America saying we are the true Christian spirit during the 19th century. So consider this. This book reveals, I'm just going to summarize again. This is the New York Times approved version of America during this time. And if you want to move on to the next slide, this will show some propaganda against the church. Notice how Pope Leo XIII is the octopus of Romanism and Jesuitism, right? He's the evil baddie you got to watch out for, Pope Leo XIII. So Protestant progress is based upon, one, male authority. The males are superior in reason and judgment. And think about this during the Marian Age, right? While women are irrational, they stay in the home where they belong, essentially, to be protected by deceptive people and influences like the Jesuits. The Jesuits want to drag the women out of the WASP home and put them in convents or bring them to live with the savages. This is the propaganda. Because back then, savages or the Native Americans were seen as not so favorable, whereas today it's the opposite, right? The Jesuits are depicted as androgynous or basically kind of like LGBT inclined. They're submissive to authority, yet they're rigidly authoritarian. So this is kind of like the weird androgyny of them. And the more effeminate androgyny of the Jesuits lent to them duping women into convents because they could relate to women. They could also relate to the masses, the ignorant mob, because the mob was deemed as irrational. So therefore it was tied to the nature of women during this time. And this was also tied to the lower class because there were a lot of like wage rebellion, stuff like that. And also related to the savages, right? So I'll lump that all together, right? Lower class working against the capitalist bigwigs, the Indians or the savages, and then the ignorant mobs, the irrational mobs, and then women, right? Now, what they say is that these Jesuits are going to use the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola that are designed to, quote, annihilate reason and make him into a robotic, conscienceless being that's completely amoral and just passively carrying out the monstrous orders of his superiors, probably people like the Pope. This is all the propaganda that's being insinuated in arts, entertainment, education. It's just all over the place, right? Now, again, I'm kind of exaggerating some of it for effect, but this is what's being implied. Some of them are more radical versions than others. And then this is in contrast to the strong wasp man who seizes his destiny. He expands and conquers. He pioneers. And Catholic men are kind of more like effeminate Mary worshippers. Protestant education is superior. Catholic education is infiltrating, uprooting American values. As you can see in the Papal Octopus, if you read that, it talks about the American public school being under threat with Roman ignorance infiltrating. And then, this is the interesting thing, Catholic nuns and convents were attacked, and they were called insane asylums, basically seen as for breeding mental illnesses. And they did take some cases where there were some strange instances, but like they're isolated instances that they use to prop up, to paint the picture of all these institutions. They basically call them, the celibacy of the nuns led them to become fornication crazy, if you will. So the chastity repressed their sexuality, and that had the opposite effect where they wanted to go open borders with it, right? Or they would also become butch authoritarians, basically, and like, you know, very masculine women who were ordering everyone around. This is like the play on and balancing the sexes. This is what the Jesuits are responsible for. And so they also equated this with Amazonian women sometime. Now, think about this. Think about God judging nations. What has happened since this time where the Protestant Masonic New York Times approved vision of America has declared this and then projected what the Catholic regime actually, what they thought it was? Well, have we degenerated into an amoral millennial culture that's robotic and just obeys its media masters? Has the feminist movement made people mentally ill with asserting authoritarian, kind of dogmatism? Yet there's kind of like a fornication, open borders craziness. Have men become effeminized and they're kind of worshiping the goddess, right? Because like the Catholic men, they're just Mary worshipers back then. Well, now they're just kind of bowing down to all these feminists and just telling them, oh, you tell me what to do, right? So is that what has actually happened? And it's inverted everything that they said that they blamed the Catholics for and become the very things that they said that they hated. And ironically, nowadays, the Catholic side, Catholics who become what the Protestants said they were are accepted by our society, right? And the Jesuits have kind of become the LGBT Jesuits hanging out at the Amazonian Synod or whatever, right? And who are usurping male authority. They want to get away from the patriarchal church. And now WASP America loves the Pope and all of these things. And that brings us to where we are now. So I don't know about you, but I find that very strange and very providential in terms of it's war in heaven, you know?
So what was the quotation? You said it was New York Times, and this is what, 1860s, 70s, 80s?
I'm kind of summarizing it into an archetype where when people listen to the New York Times, that tells you what you need to think about America, right? So all these institutions that are quoted, the New York Observer, the Gazettes, the universities, this would be the mainstream message that's being pushed out to attack Catholicism. But like I said, this book quotes all these different establishments. So I'm just kind of synthesizing it as being the New York Times approved version for effect. Basically, this is the general message. So read the book and you'll see that that's what was being pumped out to attack Catholicism during that time. And I never knew about any of that. Very hidden, right?
Yes. So we have during this period the Marian dogma of the Immaculate Conception, which is against Pius IX, said that it was humbling those who exalt in human reason above its limits, in that we can create a society without God, without the Holy Mass as the center governing all things, and man is not afflicted by original sin. So the Immaculate Conception in Mary is against all that. So there's a 100-year period between 1848, or the 1854 definition, or this whole period, 1848, 1854 definition, and all the way 100 years later, 1950, the Assumption of Mary defined. And it seems to be very much the same battle, just continuing on. The industrialization continues and breaks out into World War I, where monarchy is finally obliterated with the help of the American Empire. There's a truce after World War I, which eventually continues into the new war, World War II. So
yeah, I can wrap up in 4 minutes here.
Go ahead.
I think it will help. This will bring in the other side of the coin, the Axis side, right? We just talked about the Allies, or what that kind of brought about. So if you go to the last slide here, this is Ernst Haeckel. I think you've talked about him before, but basically he's the one who popularized Darwin, kept the Darwinian spirit going. This is taken on the right from his book Against the Jesuits. And you can see he's saying that this Irish Catholic prelate here, boy, doesn't he look a lot like this ape? Right? So here we have the Darwinian attack on Catholicism. And so this is how he's opening his book, right? Very scientific of him.
What book was this?
This is Ernst Haeckel's Answer to the Jesuits, because the Jesuits were attacking evolution during this time.
What was the year here?
Ernst Haeckel was born 1834, died in 1919.
Yes, he's playing on the fact that he's called the primate of England, or the primate of Ireland.
Right. And so interesting.
Wow.
Think about again, measuring the same standards of judgment. What did the Allies do to the Germans? They depict them as apish brutes.
Yes. Right.
So this is during the Kulturkampf that this is all happening. And then once the wars come out of that, isn't it interesting how that gets returned back here? Depicting the Germans as apish brutes. And again, I'm not condoning any of this. I'm just saying, look at the spiritual warfare here. I think that might be manifesting, and the irony and the hypocrisies that happen over these, decades. Right. And so Haeckel, I'm going to read a quote from his Answers to the Jesuits, because the Jesuits were attacking his Darwinian dogmas, so-called. Quote, page 7-8, the known frauds of Jesuitism, perpetrating the riskiest falsifications in science, they adopted the genuinely Jesuitic tactics of charging others with their own crimes. Their influence upon world history is well known. They have the spirit of lying and hypocrisy at the bottom of their whole system, and their main principle, ends justify the means, have become a byword. Any transgression, any crime is permitted if it serves the highest end. That sounds more like the Bavarian Illuminati to me. So you could perhaps see the influence of the Bavarian Illuminati in Germany with their anti-Jesuit polemics here, where they're blaming everything that they're doing themselves on the Jesuits. And here's the interesting thing. If people look up Father John Hardon, one of the better modern Jesuits, right? Yes. He is an interesting, I would say, Jesuitical answer to evolutionary theory. There's a video of him talking about it. And basically, to summarize it, this is probably what was being attacked by the Jesuits against Darwin during these times, I would assume. He's basically saying that Catholics, for them to believe in any sort of evolutionary theory, this is what could be accepted and what not. He says spiritual evolution, perhaps akin to Desjardins, absolutely not. You can't accept that. Evolution of the universe as not being suddenly created, like six-day creation. He said it could be held, but there's little foundation. He wouldn't put any weight behind it. Anthropological evolution, like animals can evolve. He says it's conjecture, but it could be held under these conditions. First is that evolution was terminated once Adam was created. B, that evolution was entirely controlled by God. And that C, man was created unique by God. He didn't come from the animals. Therefore, God infused him with a special human soul and human heart. Those are the conditions. So that doesn't violate the doctrine of original sin or any of that stuff. So I wonder if these were the types of answers these Jesuits were formulating against people like Haeckel, and he was getting really triggered by it. And he's an interesting Protestant background as well. So I thought that was interesting. And to wrap it up, there's just a lot of crazy anti-Jesuit stuff that leads up to the Nazis. I'll put it in the sources, but nevertheless, you have some weird Young Turks connections with this. There's like this Zionist movement forming. The Nazis are kind of tied to this and helping export the Jews to Palestine, despite, you know, the chaos of World War II and all the things that go wrong with everything in that time. But nevertheless, there's a great book. I'll just mention it and then I'll wrap it up. The Nazi Persecution of the Churches by J.S. Conway. If you look through this, go to the index and look under Jesuits. And it's pretty interesting, the propaganda against the Jesuits, especially in Bavaria. There was a big battle in Bavaria of the Nazis against the Jesuits. There's all kinds of propaganda. The typical buzzwords that we all mentioned here that you see in the Allies are here in the Axis as well. And I would say that, to wrap it up, in my opinion, the world rejecting the papal Jesuit plan, and especially in all the problems in Europe, Central Europe, the Habsburgs, the Christian Social Party, Engelbert Dollfuss, Karl Lueger, all these sorts of people. Again, they might have their own little fighting and battles, but I think that plan for Europe might have prevented a lot of problems, a lot of chaos. And that all kind of culminates with Karl of Austria being exiled and ejected, right? And so, you know, I would say that these dialectics involve the Axis and the Allied powers. It's just the original Protestant OG powers, right? With Britain and then the Anglo Empire and then the Anglo-US Empire duking it out and the church being caught in the middle. And then the book also, the last thing we'll mention, we'll bring it back to the original source, the Jesuit Restoration. They have a whole chapter on the destruction of the Jesuits that goes back to the looting we talked about at the initial suppression. And we have the bombing of Nagasaki, where the Jesuit martyrs were, that D'Alembert was saying that they should drive out the Jesuits like the Japanese emperors, right? Nagasaki was called the Rome of Japan. There also seems to be like this, what I call Catholicized Lutheran influence and like Baroque influence that started to kind of merge with some of the Protestant culture in Germany. A lot of that, I think, was destroyed with the Allied bombing. And I'm just going to give a little list of the main churches and properties that suffered the most damage that's tied to the Jesuits. And I think it's very interesting if you bring it back to the serpent enmity. One, St. John the Baptist in Koblenz. I'm going to butcher these names. 2, the Immaculate Conception building or church in Freiburg. Some of these might be churches or universities, I don't know, but the namesakes I think are more important. 3, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary in Cologne. 4, St. Michael's in Munich, Bavaria. The University of Munster, which contained the library of St. Peter, right? The Rock of Peter, which was called the Hammer of the Protestants. There was 300,000 books destroyed, 2/3 of the collection, and there's other miscellaneous things destroyed. So it's very interesting that they chose these locations that all are very intertwined with Marian dogmas and defenders of them. So again, I think that viewing it more as a powers and principalities battle and trying to get away from blaming specific humans in some all-encompassing sense might be a better way to try to view all these things. That's certainly what I've been forced to be confronted with as I've gone through all this.
Absolutely. Yeah. The conspiracy of Antichrist brings together all anti-Catholic forces, which is orchestrated by the fallen angels. And these men are just puppets of the demons. But like you said, God can bring good out of evil. The destruction of the Jesuits that we've traced here coming up to the post-war period is the destruction of Catholic order, which is very much tied to the education of the common layman, which was being done by the Jesuits. So many Jesuit universities, education, all these different universities, people are being educated by the Jesuits. They destroy the Jesuits, and that is when the despotic power of the central state, whether that's a monarchy or the republic, especially the republics, they just increase exponentially. The power of the central government increases exponentially. They eventually replace the Jesuit education with public education, which is designed to worship the state. And then by World War I, they're destroying the last vestiges of any Christian civilization. The efforts to create a Christian civilization after World War I, those are ultimately destroyed by the Allies in World War II because they promote a secular state. Even though, even in France and Germany after the war, they're trying to create a Christian state to rebuild. But what ends up happening is there's a secular state. So this is what creates ultimately this whole arc from the Jesuits destroying the basis of education, being replaced by the secular public education for the common man, and the increased power of the state through this whole period. This is what creates the modern world. It needed to be this Masonic conspiracy beginning with the Jesuits, was necessary with a great deal of bloodshed and violence to destroy the Catholic order, which was based on the local rule of the local government, your city, your village, that type of thing. That's destroyed. And now we're all under, like you said, it's been reversed into this, everyone just obeying the media and obeying the government.
Yeah. I think the World War II is really just the culmination of all this chaos. And, it started all the globalist institutions that are a problem today, and, this, in my opinion, obviously we didn't get into it much, but I think it foreshadows and culminates with Fatima, in a lot of ways, like what people like. It's easy to focus on all the Fatima stuff that we see very relevant, in my opinion. But I think that this is like the Mariology that's leading up to that as like an alternative culminating event that's a lot more hidden, and becoming more and more relevant every day, in my opinion.
So what do you say? Alberto says, is there one major lesson that could be gleaned from this time period that may help us in our current times?
I think it's just taking inspiration from a lot of these hidden figures that look at their situation. It's very dismal, very dark, and just a horrible situation, and a lot of betrayals and stuff like that. But what did they do? They doubled down, and they focused on the devotions, the sacraments. They dealt with political powers as they needed to. That was a secondary thing, right? And I think that if I think a lot of the Mariology is very prophetic. I mean, St. Louis de Montfort was writing all of that, in the 17th century, and look at all of that. The more Marian dogmas have been revealed, the more perhaps triggered the satanic forces have become. I mean, to me, it just kind of proves it to me. That's just my opinion. So I think it shows, in one sense, the uniqueness of Roman Catholicism with the Mariology. Obviously you can get carried away with it on the other end of that, but nevertheless, I think that is starting to establish something over time that we can also take heart in, because of a lot of the foundations that we might be accustomed to in the Catholic Church seemingly crumbling. And also, last thing I'd mention, think about the story of Job. I think that the Pope Leo's vision is very Job-esque, where Satan makes a request to destroy the church, and it's granted, and Job's just kind of suffer through his own version of that, as perhaps the church might. So maybe that's relevant as well. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you. So Nick asks, it feels like Catholicism has been losing the battle, especially in the narrative, for centuries. How do we fight this? It can be overwhelming.
I mean, I think it's the same thing. A lot of these Jesuits who were trying to convert people, they were disappointed, but it's like not worrying about seeing a sinking ship on the exoteric surface and just going through it, right? And just like, Christ with Peter walking on the water, taking your eyes off what's important, and then the apostles being upset when on the ship with the sea. I think just not losing sight of the spiritual reality of it all. I mean, that's how I personally get through it. And I don't know. It just, all this stuff is more inspiring to me, in my opinion. Maybe other people haven't thought of it that way. But I just think there's a lot of hidden heroes, a lot of synchronicities that just show God's providence and God's control over all of this, but allowing things to happen. And I think that these hidden heroes, you see that there's another whole layer that's holding things up. And like the Jesuit story in Russia, it's like we only have all of this resistance in the 19th century thanks to what was going on there, along with other things. That was kind of like a primary thing. So to me, it's like you don't know what's going to happen afterwards. So if you work with what you've got, like the Jesuits in Quebec, they thought they were going to die out. Look what they did and look what they prepared for. And then later on, 50, 60 years later, they got allowed back into Canada and strengthened Catholicism in Canada in a really hardcore way.
So Brendan is asking about what do you see happening next in the sort of demonic conspiracy? What is the next step in this in going forward? Where do we go from here?
Well, I'm just one guy with an opinion, I'm just trying to take some of the history and see if it's relevant to our times, which I think it is. But for me, I don't know. But in my opinion, like I said, I think a lot of the Fatima stuff is very interesting. It almost seems like there's like a 70 AD 2.0 event prophesied there. I don't know what that all means, but with the idea of a consecration of Russia and conversion, you see a lot of weird pieces that are being set up, and we just need to work with them the best that we can according to our own state in life. And for me, that's me just trying to get married and have a family and sustain that first, and then figure out where I'm going, because I have a lot of confusing things in my life, but I'm just trying to stay focused on that personally, but it's going to vary for anybody else. So I don't have any really amazing words to say other than that for my own life. That's what it is, because my situation is different than most people probably, I'm sure.
Here's a question. How do we fight the modernist forces inside our own church? The parish that we go to, what do we do in our own parish?
Well, I can give a personal story, and maybe that will be helpful. When I came back to the church, I had a lot of knowledge on these things, but I came back to the Novus Ordo parish thinking like there was kind of an elitism that I think just happens when you look at all this stuff and you see the traditional Catholicism and you're upset that you don't see it happening and you want someone else to kind of do it, right? And so for me, long story short, I came back and I heard a sermon that was a little Gnostic-ish. And I wrote the priest, and I was very respectful, but I kind of ladled maybe a little bit more conspiratorial than I should have at the time. But nevertheless, he was very respectful, and it actually changed his sermon. But what I hadn't realized is that me being back in the church, I didn't know a lot about the faith because I grew up in a more watered down version of it. So I was actually receiving the sacrament when I shouldn't have. And so ironically, when I went to confession, realizing that, I was face to face with that same priest, and I kind of apologized to him for like, the things I was criticizing you about are like pale in comparison to what I was doing. And so that was a very humbling moment for me, And so I try to be very non-Pharisaical as I can and think about the bigger picture. And I think a lot of things that you control what you can in your own life. And, I had another Gnostic infiltration in my other church when I moved. And I had a lot more personal attachment to this church. And I fighting all the same stuff, ironically. And I wrote a letter and I explained it all. And I tried to be very respectful. Eventually, it was like agree to disagree. And we weren't really let back there because it was, very much the Democratic Church of America infiltrating there. But I didn't leave with some sort of hostility, just disappointment. And then luckily, I was able to find an awesome Latin Mass parish after that. But I think it's because I was at least luckily able to handle those situations and not be a jerk about it and be overly Pharisaical and almost like I was being confronted with that at every step. And so that's what I really try to encourage, at least when I do stuff, is to, take all the gnosis and try not to become elitist about it on one hand, and then just do the best you can and pray and just ask for help. That's what's gotten me through the past couple of years. And I still struggle with lots of things, and I'm not perfect. And I'm sure I screwed up a lot of things in the research too, but I try my best.
Well, Michael, we really appreciate you've gone through 7 total parts now. So it's about 8 hours worth of material that you've presented here on Meaning of Catholic. And so really appreciate your time, Michael. Thank you for all of the great information you've shared. Christ against the occult. Any final words to end this series?
I think I'm all tapped out. I'll be silent for once. But, you know, in the future, I'd like to come back on and talk a little bit more. I just need a bit of a break. And I appreciate very much you having me on and giving me this opportunity. And, you know, my whole inspiration for this was just to show more of appreciation and respect for all these people who are way stronger than I have been in history, who are very unknown. I think hopefully this episode really helped reveal a lot of unknown figures that I think are heroes.
Excellent. Well, let's pray for the enthronement of Christ the King in our families, because that's where it begins, that our children may be raised with Christ the King in a hostile society that is in demonic captivity, and that the throne of Christ may be raised in our society. So let me get my resurrection icon here so we can pray. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater noster, qui es in caelis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
Panem nostrum quotidianum de nobis hodie, et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Christ is risen.